Today's podcast will feature 3 stories that are all about people who appeared to have a paranormal encounter. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called The Friend, and it's about a girl who gets lost hiking, and while she's lost, she makes contact with a very strange companion. The second story you'll hear is called The Midnight Man, and it's about a woman who wakes up in the middle of the night and sees a man just in her room. And the third and final story you'll hear is called From the Field, and it's about a man who gets into a freak accident while riding his motorcycle, but no one can explain the series of events that happen next. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please replace the Follow Button's 2026 calendar with a 2025 calendar that just has a 6 glued over the 5. Okay, let's get into our first story called The Friend. On April 29, 2001, 6-year-old Haley Zega was on a hike with her grandparents in a very rural part of Arkansas called the Upper Buffalo Wilderness Area. For an area to be deemed a wilderness area, that means no vehicles of any kind can come through there, making it incredibly remote and incredibly wild, hence the name. They had taken this trail that brought them up to the top of this bluff that was about 200 feet higher than where they started, and they got to this incredible overlook, and they're looking down over this river, and at some point at about 11 in the morning, they turn around to head back. On the return trip, by about 11:30, they're making their way down, and Haley spots a waterfall that's off the side of the path, and she wants to go to it. She asks her grandparents, can we go check out this waterfall? And the grandparents kind of scope it out, and it seemed like the only way they could get down to view this waterfall would be by literally climbing a tree and descending over this cliff, and it was something that the grandparents just did not feel comfortable letting their granddaughter do, and so they told Haley, no, we need to keep going, we're not going to go check out that waterfall. And Haley, being a 6-year-old, she really wanted to see this waterfall, and she wanted to get her way, and so she threw a tantrum. And she sat down on the trail and she said, well, if you're not going to take me to the waterfall, I'm not going to move. You're going to have to carry me. And the grandparents were like, no, we're not going to carry you. You need to be a big girl. I need you to stand up and start walking with us. And Haley refused. And so her grandparents said, okay, we're going to leave you. And they turned around and they kept walking down the trail. Not far, and they were still totally in view, and it's broad daylight. And they would turn around expecting their granddaughter to stand up and begrudgingly walk after them. And at some point she did. Haley stood up and she's like, okay, wait for me. And so she starts walking and the grandparents are like, all right. And so they're walking ahead of Haley. And as they're walking, Haley would just slow down more and more and more. And her grandparents could tell she was doing this. She was just trying to be frustrating and she was intentionally trying to take as long as she could. But the grandparents made sure they kept her in their view. So they would walk a little ways and turn and she'd be right there. They'd walk a little ways, they'd turn and she'd be right there over and over again. And then at some point when they turned, she wasn't there. And so the grandparents immediately run back up and they're looking around for Haley, thinking she probably darted behind a tree to hide because she wants, to be a little bit more frustrating for them. And so they're kind of looking for her. They're not that worried yet. They start yelling for her, saying, come on, we do got to leave. You got to come out. We got to go. But there was no word from Haley. It was just silence and she was just totally gone. And for the next 90 minutes, the grandparents just ran all up and down this trail screaming for Haley, and they never found her. And so they ran down and they called police. The largest search and rescue mission in the history of Arkansas was launched for Haley Zega. It included hundreds of searchers on the ground, including 8 dog teams and helicopters overhead. There were firefighters, the National Guard was involved. But after 2 days, despite this incredible search, really no progress had been made. The only thing that had been found was one of the dog teams had tracked her scent up to a nearby road where the dog stopped, meaning the scent is now gone. And unfortunately, what that told investigators is it looks like Haley got picked up by some motorist. But 51 hours into the ordeal, there were 2 searchers well outside of the primary search area. They were about 2 miles away from where she'd gone missing. They spotted her. She was sitting next to this brook with her feet dangling in the water. And when she saw them, she kind of waved and they said, are you Haley Zega? And she said, yeah. And she had a couple of scratches on her arm and on her face, but overall she seemed okay. And so Haley was reunited with her family and then she was brought to the hospital to be observed. After Haley had regained some of her strength, investigators asked her, what happened? And she said that she was walking behind her grandparents and that she looked down. And then when she looked up again, not only were her grandparents gone, but she was looking at this wall of trees. Like she was not on the trail anymore. She didn't know where she was. And since she was only 6 years old, she didn't stop and look around or yell. Instead, she just kept walking in this direction that she didn't recognize. And she walked and walked and walked, and she never found the trail again. She said pretty soon it got dark and she slept on top of that bluff. And then the next day when the sun came up, she walked down the bluff and she made it to the river. Then she walked along the river until she found a cave where she slept for the second night. And then the next day when she got up, she was found. After she gave this explanation, investigators had a lot of questions, like, if you were sleeping up on the bluff on that first night, then why couldn't the helicopter see you? Because that's all they were doing, was flying over the bluff, and they had thermal imaging. They could have very easily picked you up. And so they asked her, are you sure that's where you were? And she said, yeah, that's where Alicia told me to stay. And they were like, who's Alicia? And she said, oh, she's my imaginary friend. I met her on the bluff. And so immediately the investigators and the parents are like, okay, she's clearly coping with this traumatic event by creating this imaginary friend. And so they don't ask any more questions about the imaginary friend. Instead, they continue to ask questions about basically how she got from where she was lost to where she was found. And they say, okay, Haley, how did you get down the bluffs? Because there's only one way down and it can be hard to find, especially if you're off the trail. And Haley said, well, Alicia brought me to a trail and she led me down the bluffs. And she stood in front of me and made sure that I didn't fall forward. And so her parents and the investigators are now starting to think, maybe this isn't an imaginary friend if this person is right in front of her kind of propping her up. And so they asked Haley, can you describe what Alicia looks like? And Haley said, sure, she has black hair, brown eyes, she's a little bit shorter than me, she's 4 years old, she likes to tell jokes, and she likes to sing songs. And then Haley began singing songs that she had learned from Alicia and began telling jokes she had learned from Alicia. Even though Haley was giving this vivid description of this 4-year-old girl named Alicia running around the bluffs, it just couldn't be possible. And so Haley's parents and the investigators went back to treating Alicia as just an imaginary friend, just a simple coping mechanism. And so the investigators went back to just doing their interview with Haley. They got all the information about how she got from the bluffs down to the river as much as they could. And then because Haley was fine, they said, okay, you're good. See you later. Now, Haley's case was a really big deal and it was all over the news, especially after she was found. And so her interview where she said this imaginary friend named Alicia had assisted her in getting down the bluffs and had basically taken care of her, that was put in print. And after it was published, there were some readers that realized there was another little girl who had gone missing in the exact same spot as Haley 23 years earlier. She was 4 years old, she had black hair, brown eyes, her name was Alana, and she had died on those bluffs. After this connection was made, it got national media attention because suddenly news outlets were saying this imaginary friend was actually Alana and that she was Haley's guardian angel. In fact, Haley was brought on Dateline to talk about her imaginary friend. Our next story is called The Midnight Man. One night in the summer of 1904, a young woman named Anna Gray was laying in her bed in her second-story room in a bed and breakfast in Chicago, Illinois. Except she couldn't sleep. She couldn't really tell why she couldn't sleep, but, her stomach was kind of upset from the mince pie she had eaten earlier, and it was kind of, her stomach was rumbling around, and so maybe that was why. And also, the air in the room was very stuffy, there wasn't any circulation, and so she's just laying in silence as her stomach is growling, and it was very uncomfortable. And so eventually, Anna felt so frustrated that she was not able to sleep that finally she just threw the covers off, hopped out of her bed, and walked over to the window, and she opened it up to let in some fresh air. And even though, her stomach still felt pretty upset, having the fresh air hit her and sort of circulate through the room did, even if it was just by a small percentage, make her feel a little bit better. And now that she was standing up near the window and sort of realizing how late it was, she suddenly did feel sort of tired. And she was like, great, I'll leave the window open and I'll go back to sleep. So she walked back to her bed, laid down, pulled the covers up over her, and sure enough, just a couple of minutes later, she had fallen asleep. But several hours later, Anna suddenly woke up. She's laying in her bed, her eyes shoot open, and for a second as she's laying there, she can't quite remember where she is. She's confused, disoriented, and then she remembers, oh yeah, I'm in that bed and breakfast, I'm in Chicago, okay, I'm going home tomorrow, okay. But as she's laying there, sort of putting together what's happening, she just has this weird feeling that something just feels off in the room. She can't quite place it, but there's something wrong here. And so instinctively, Anna sits up in her bed and she kind of just surveys this small room that she's in. And at first, everything seems totally in order. There's nothing odd here at all. It's just a late night inside of a bed and breakfast. It's still, it's quiet. There's nothing going on here. But then as she scans the room one more time, her eyes stop on the open window because now there is a man sitting on the windowsill, looking into the room right at her, unflinching, just staring right at her. And Anna, in an instant, is looking at the sky and a million thoughts go through her head. She's thinking, oh my God, he's here to hurt me. He must have climbed up and he's about to come in here and attack me. Like, what's going on here? She doesn't know if she's dreaming. She's just completely panicked. And unlike a lot of people who in this situation might freeze completely or scream and try to hide or run away, Anna's fight or flight response was to fight. And so it was almost like in a fraction of a second, she had leapt out of the bed to confront this man, this stranger in her room. But the man, as soon as she jumped up, he didn't budge. He's just sitting there staring at her. Then almost like delicately, he leaned backwards and fell out the window. And now Anna's thinking, oh my God, is he okay? She doesn't know who he is, but that's a serious fall. They're on the second floor. And so she runs to the window, looking out, expecting to see this guy, with a broken neck down on the ground. But she looks down and there's nobody there. The window's wide open. She left it open before. And so she's kind of looking around to make sure, did he really fall out the window? Did he come into the room? But no, she's all alone in her room. And so she's looking down to see if maybe he kind of ran up against the side of the house and maybe he's going to show himself, but there's nobody. And then at some point she notices there's this long, dark car that's parked out on the street underneath the streetlight. And she couldn't remember if that car had been parked there the whole time. It seemed sort of out of place, but she just couldn't remember. And so she's looking at this vehicle and she realizes there's somebody in the car. And as she's staring at the car, the driver begins to move. They sort of position their bodies down low and they look up at Anna. And Anna realizes it's the same guy who was just sitting in her windowsill and fell out the window a second ago. He's in this car. And so Anna, she's just frozen looking at this guy, wondering, how could this be happening? Is this a nightmare? Is this real? She doesn't know. But as she's looking, this guy who's looking up at her, he extends his hand out the driver's side window and begins beckoning to Anna, telling her to come down and get in the car with him. And so Anna, she's seeing this and she's also realizing the car he is in is a hearse. And so she is just beyond terrified, and instinctively she just jumps back, slams the window, and sort of just pretends like this can't be happening, like this is not real. But then after a couple of seconds, she's thinking, I gotta make sure I know where this guy is, where he's gonna go next. And so she goes right back to the window to see what he's doing. But now the hearse, the man, they're gone. And so Anna remained at this window for quite a while, just looking out the window, just making sure this guy really was gone. Because again, she just doesn't know, like, was this real? Am I imagining things? Am I going crazy? Was this a nightmare? Like, she doesn't know. And so she's just standing there waiting, watching, but this guy doesn't reappear. The hearse doesn't reappear. And so eventually she crawls back in bed. And after what felt like forever, she drifted off into a fairly light sleep. And then before long, she opened her eyes again and sunlight had filled the room. She had survived the night. And so now, feeling the comfort and safety of light in the room and knowing that it's a new day, she told herself, wow, like that was crazy. That was terrifying. That had to have been just a particularly vivid nightmare. Like there's no other reasonable explanation for this. It had to be a nightmare. So Anna got out of bed, convinced she was just fine, that nothing strange has happened here at all. She got herself together and she left the bed and breakfast and she headed out to this brand new department store that had just opened up in Chicago. She wanted to go and have a nice day of shopping. And so Anna gets to this department store and it's so vibrant and it's bustling with people and there's 4 floors of all this incredible stuff that they're selling. And for the next several hours, Anna just has a great time walking all around, picking out things she likes and just basically enjoying shopping. And then eventually, when she was up on the 4th floor, after she had purchased all the things she was going to buy, she decided it was time to leave. Now, by this point, she had basically completely forgotten about, whatever happened the night before. The sky, the hearse, all of it. It was completely out of her mind. She is back to normal. And so she makes her way over to the elevator to go down to the 1st floor. And so she hits the button and she's waiting and waiting. And then eventually she hears a noise, a dinging sound, and the doors open up. And there's loads of people on this elevator car. It is packed. And so, like most of us would do in this situation, Anna kind of waved them off and said, I'll take the next one. And she's expecting that, the doors will close and these folks will go down and, when it comes back up, she'll get on and that's that. This is like not a big deal at all. She's not even thinking about it. Just go ahead. But the doors don't close. And instead, as she's kind of, not really looking over in their direction, she hears this voice come out of the elevator car. And it's this kind of rude tone. It's a man's voice, and he calls out, "One more," like demanding that Anna get in there. Like, what are you doing? You're holding up the car. And Anna was kind of taken aback by whoever was kind of barking this order at her. And she turned around and she looked into the elevator car, and she couldn't really tell where the voice was coming from. But then eventually she noticed it was coming from the guy who operated the elevator car. The elevator was manual. There was somebody who literally moved the car up and down, and she kind of didn't see the guy's face at first, but eventually, when the guy kind of poked his head through and looked at her, confirming that, "Yeah, I'm talking to you, get in the car," she realized the elevator car operator was the man in the hearse that she had seen in her windowsill. It was the same guy. And so Anna is so horrified, she gasped out loud and just was like, "No, I'm not going in there, no." And so all the folks that are in the elevator car, they do not know what's going on, and they're kind of looking around like, what's happening here? And the car operator continues to look out at Anna for a second, then he just kind of scoffs at her like, "Fine." Then the doors close and the elevator disappears. And for a moment, Anna's telling herself, like, what is going on? That can't be the same guy. It's just going to be a coincidence, right? But as she's having these thoughts, these crazy thoughts, trying to rationalize something that's not rational, she suddenly heard this loud, metallic, crunching sound inside of the elevator shaft, followed by what was obviously people screaming. It would turn out that elevator car that she nearly got into, but didn't because of her fear of this guy that she was seeing again, the same guy from her bedroom the night before, that elevator car, as it began its descent, it malfunctioned and fell 4 stories, killing 2 people on board. Now, unfortunately, we don't really know much more about what ultimately happened with the elevator operator, if they ever confirmed without a doubt that, that guy is the same one Anna saw the night before, or if he even really was on the elevator car. We don't know that. But what we do know is Anna did speak to reporters, and they did widely publish this story. And that is how we know about it. The next and final story of today's episode is called From the Field. At 5:15 p.m. on June 28, 1980, a 38-year-old man named Robert Davidson drove his motorcycle down Interstate 74 in Acton, Indiana, which is a small community just outside of Indianapolis. On the back of the motorcycle, with her arms wrapped around his waist, was Robert's wife. Her name was Wanda. The couple was on their way to visit family, and they were hoping to get there as soon as possible, not because they wanted to visit, but because there was a big storm rolling in, and they were hoping to beat the rain. In fact, right now, right above them, the sky was turning a dark gray and looked very ominous. But as Robert nudged his engine to go a little bit faster, these big raindrops began pelting his arms, and he knew the skies were opening up and he would have to pull over so he and his wife could put on rain jackets. And so Robert pulled over to the side of the road, and as soon as he was stopped, Wanda climbed off, and Robert was about to climb off as well and open up the little trunk in the back of the motorcycle to get the rain jackets. But before he did that, there was this sudden flash of light, and then Robert felt pain all throughout his body, his muscles went totally rigid, and then he crumpled off his bike onto the ground, and everything went black. Less than 5 minutes later, an ambulance arrived on the scene, and several first responders jumped out, including a woman named Kimberly Cobb. Now, Kimberly had been briefed up on this situation. A man and his wife had pulled over on the side of Interstate 74, and the man had been struck by lightning. And so as she ran up to the couple, she could see Robert was on the ground. He was not moving. His skin was waxy and gray, and his wife was sort of in shock, and she was standing next to him, just kind of sobbing uncontrollably. And Kimberly, she jumped into action. She jumped down next to Robert, and she felt for a pulse, but he didn't have one. At this point, Kimberly knew she maybe had a couple of minutes here to basically revive Robert, or he was doomed. And so Kimberly, she worked immediately on stabilizing Robert's spine while one of her team members, one of the other first responders, jumped in and began doing CPR. And then a third first responder hopped on the ambulance radio and called in an emergency medical helicopter to get here and fly Robert to a hospital as soon as possible. They quickly got a response from the helicopter crew saying they were en route, but before the crew or any of the first responders could communicate any further over the radio, suddenly, out of nowhere, their ambulance just completely shut down. Like completely shut off, the lights, the sirens, the engine, everything went completely silent. And this was a huge problem because some of the medical equipment that they needed to keep Robert alive until the helicopter got here required the ambulance to be on to use it. And so with the ambulance off, it was useless. But in addition to just what a problem this also was like really confusing to Kimberly and the other first responders. Because when ambulances are built, they are built with the idea that there can never be a situation where the ambulance just totally turns off. Because again, it's like a worst case scenario. And so they give each ambulance 2 batteries, a primary and a backup, so that if for some reason the primary dies, you always have that backup and can always use the life-saving equipment. So the idea that both of these batteries failed simultaneously was like, how? How could that possibly happen? But before Kimberly or the other first responders could even begin to understand how that happened, something else began happening. They turned and saw there was this woman dressed in this old, long black dress running up the road, this desolate highway. This woman is charging up the road, screaming at them, and above her head, she's waving a Bible and she's yelling at them to, "Hey, let me touch him! Let me touch him! I can save him!" And the first responders are looking at each other like, what is going on here? Now, none of the first responders, nor Wanda, had any idea who this woman was as she continued running up the road, waving her Bible and yelling at them. But again, you need to picture this scene. The ambulance is off. They can't do anything to help Robert. They're basically waiting for the helicopter to show up, which they hope is on the way, but they can't communicate with the helicopter. And Robert basically is clinically dead at this point. He doesn't have a pulse. He's been struck by lightning. Like there's nothing anybody can do except wait around and hope the helicopter shows up. And so when this woman came running up to the scene saying she could touch Robert and save him, none of the first responders were like, oh yeah, that's a great idea. Let's bring her in. She can save the day. But they were sort of like, well, no one else is doing anything. And they looked over at Wanda and she was just as shocked as they were at this woman's arrival and what she was saying. And so the first responders and Wanda just kind of stood there and allowed this woman in her black dress with her Bible to just wander up and crouch down next to Robert and begin this totally bizarre ritual. At first, the woman just began praying over Robert, and she's holding her Bible, and she's very focused, and she's calm. And again, Kimberly, the first responders, and Wanda, they're all just standing there looking at each other and looking at this woman being like, what is going on here? But then eventually, this woman in black, she begins getting really animated and begins slamming her Bible on the ground over and over again and begins screaming up at the heavens, demanding they save this man's life. Now, Kimberly and the others and Wanda, they're all watching this in total shock and just kind of let it keep on happening. Because again, it was sort of like, at this point, we're already committed, and what harm can this woman do? I mean, Robert's clinically dead. And so Kimberly and the others just stood there silently watching as this woman in black continued to slam her Bible and demand that this man be saved. And then it was like something came over this woman. It was like she was completely possessed, and she grabbed her Bible and she lifted it over her head. She's kneeling right beside Robert. And when she opened her mouth and looked up at the sky, it wasn't her voice that came out. It was like another voice, and she began speaking in tongues, things that didn't make any sense. She's saying all these crazy gibberish things to the sky. And as Kimberly and the others are getting frightened by what they're seeing and are about to step in, it was like the woman just stopped. She stood up slowly, turned, and walked down the road back the direction she came. And within seconds of this woman beginning to walk off, the ambulance turned back on, lights, sirens, the engine all came back on, nothing wrong with it, and Robert began to breathe. Kimberly and the other first responders and Wanda just stared at Robert in total shock. He had not had a heartbeat for several minutes, like he was dead. How he's alive when there was no medical intervention, really, because the ambulance was off? The only intervention was this woman and whatever she was doing? Like, nobody could comprehend that. But before anybody could make sense of that, the medical helicopter arrived, and seconds later it was chaos getting Robert onto the helicopter, and then before long, Robert, Wanda, and the helicopter took off. And then before long, Kimberly and the other first responders were just left there in the first moment of silence they had had for several minutes, just standing on the side of Interstate 74 thinking, what just happened? Now, none of the first responders wanted to admit to this, but they were all thinking the same thing. That woman in black had to have done something that brought Robert back to life. I mean, there really was no other explanation. However, when the first responders just all kind of looked in the direction where this woman had turned and walked off just a couple of minutes earlier, she was gone. Now keep in mind where she had come from, where she had, run up the road from. It was just one big open road with really no obstructions, and then off to the side of the road was this huge open field. Basically, if someone had been walking for only a couple of minutes in that direction, from their vantage point, they would have seen them. There's nowhere to hide, there's nowhere to go. But she was gone. However, Kimberly and the other first responders would quickly learn that this particular stretch of highway, in fact, more specifically, the field off the side of this highway, had great significance to this whole story. That big field that lined Interstate 74, where effectively the woman in black had disappeared to, used to be the home of a place called the Acton Campground, which was a Methodist community in the 1800s. The members of this community were known for their really loud prayer style and also for speaking in tongues. Now, unfortunately, this community actually burned to the ground in 1864. Afterwards, they rebuilt, but then in 1905, disaster struck again and it burned to the ground again. And this time, they did not rebuild. Instead, the community was leveled to the ground, was sold off, and then eventually was just abandoned and became a big empty field. After the story of Robert's miraculous recovery began to spread, some people began to think that the woman in black might have been a ghost of one of these Acton residents from the 1800s who basically was drawn out to save Robert's life. Also, her intense prayers and speaking in tongues, along with the woman disappearing back into the field where the Acton campground had been, certainly seemed to cement the idea that this theory could actually be true. However, since that day in 1980, no one has seen the woman in black again. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone, research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio, Jordan Stidham, and Cole Lacasio. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen Podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature 3 stories about people who vanish under mysterious circumstances and the chilling questions that surface. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called The Yellow Smoke, and it's about a family who's left searching for answers after a very bizarre series of events. The second story you'll hear is called The Bennington Triangle, and it's about a hunter who goes missing in a truly infamous haunted forest. And the third and final story you'll hear is called Incommunicado, and it's about a man who abruptly stops receiving communication with a friend who's staying in this extremely remote cabin. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload 4 times a week: Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Fridays. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer the like button a nice, fresh ice cream cone. But don't tell them you've secretly hid a glass shard right in the middle of it. Okay, let's get into our first story called The Yellow Smoke. At around 8 p.m. on August 19, 1962, a 12-year-old boy named Raimundo Marfa da Silva sat near the fireplace in the main room of a shack in rural Brazil. Raimundo lived in the shack with his father Rivellino, as well as his two younger brothers, who were fast asleep in their beds inside of this main room, only a few feet away. Raimundo and his family were very, very poor. I mean, the shack was very small. It was only composed of two rooms, the main room he was in right now, and also the kitchen, which was connected by a single door. And they were truly like out in the middle of nowhere in Brazil. They had no electricity, basically no money. I mean, they really had almost nothing. And so that night, as Raimundo sat by the fire, just kind of quiet, there wasn't really much else to do here, his father, Rivellino, came into the room from the kitchen and he sat down next to him. And the two just sat there quietly, periodically poking at the fire with a stick and just sitting there enjoying the silence, doing their best not to wake up the two younger brothers. And as these two were sitting there, suddenly Raimundo heard a strange sound coming from the kitchen. And so he turned his attention and he looked into the dark kitchen. And he saw this dark figure on all fours quickly kind of maneuvering across the ground out of sight. And immediately Raimundo's terrified. He has no idea what this is. And so instinctively he turns to his dad, and his dad is also staring at the kitchen, wide-eyed, clearly having seen the same thing. And then before Raimundo could do anything, his dad jumped up and slammed the door shut, separating them from the kitchen, and locked it. And at that point, the two younger brothers, they've woken up, and all four of them are looking at each other like, what's going on? And Raimundo, he says to his dad, what was that? Now, it was clear that Rivellino was very unsettled by whatever this was. I mean, they didn't have pets. There was no other people inside of their shack. Like, there shouldn't be anything alive inside of the shack beyond them. So he doesn't know what it is. He's scared, but he tells his boys, it's okay. It's all right. I don't know what that is, but let's just stay here. We're safe. The door is locked. We're all here. We're safe. And so the boys, they all just kind of trusted their dad, and everybody just kind of hunkered down together and just sat there quietly, kind of waiting to see if they would hear anything else. And for a little while, they heard nothing. There were no more sounds coming from the kitchen. But eventually, Rivellino and his sons began to hear voices, and they were coming from outside the shack. And at first, they couldn't really tell what these voices were saying. They were kind of garbled. But eventually, they all began to hear the same thing. Whoever was out there, or whatever was out there, was talking about Rivellino. Specifically, they could hear that name. And what they were kind of saying is, if Rivellino comes out here, we're going to kill him. And the moment that all the boys sort of picked up the fact that somebody's out there and they're threatening to harm Rivellino, they're all like, Dad, what do we do? What do we do? And Rivellino, he's hearing this too, but he tells his boys, it's okay. I don't know what's going on out there, but clearly somebody is playing a cruel joke on us. This is a prank. This can't be real. And so Rivellino told his sons their plan is they're just going to stay put. They're in this room. They're safe. The door is locked. We are going to wait until the sun comes up, and then we'll figure out who did this, who's playing this prank on us. And so sure enough, Rivellino and his sons would stay in their room, barely sleeping, all the way until 6 a.m. when the sun began to come up again. And at that point, Rivellino told his sons to stay put, and he was going to go out there and investigate. And by this point, they had stopped hearing voices. There were no more sounds coming from the kitchen. It sort of felt like whatever that was, whoever that was, had passed. And so, the tension is gone, and the boys are like, okay, be careful out there, Dad. And so Rivellino, he walks over to the door that leads into the kitchen. He unlocks it, opens it up, and Raimundo, he's craning his neck, looking into the kitchen, but, he can't see anything moving around in there, even with the light coming in. And so Rivellino, he says, okay, boys, stay here. And then Rivellino goes out into the kitchen and shuts the door behind him. And while he's out there, Raimundo and his brothers, they're all listening anxiously, making sure their dad's not in trouble, but they just hear the sound of their dad just clearly walking around the kitchen. There's no commotion, there's nothing. And then a couple of minutes later, Rivellino comes back into the main room where the boys are, and he's got a knife in hand, but he tells them, it's okay, I got this from the kitchen, I'm just in case, there's nothing out here. I'm now going to go outside and just make sure nobody's outside the hut, okay? So again, stay put, I'll be right back. And so again, the boys, they're looking at their dad like, okay, we'll see you soon. Rivellino walked out again into the kitchen. He shut the door behind him. And then the boys heard the sound of the door that led outside open up. And then, presumably, Rivellino went outside. And that was the last time the boys ever spoke to their father. 6 months later, on March 10th, 1963, 5 men were out hunting in the wilderness not far from Raimundo's family's shack. And at some point, they came across this huge boulder. And this boulder had a big crevice in it, like a big gap in this rock. And one of the hunters happened to walk past it and looked into this crevice, and they found a skeleton. And that skeleton belonged to Rivellino, Raimundo's father. But that was not the end of the story. Far from it. So on the day that Rivellino stepped out the front door and then was never heard from again, Raimundo and his brothers had been instructed by their dad to stay put while Rivellino went out looking around. But Raimundo just felt really nervous after his dad had stepped out the front door and had presumably stepped outside. So he defied his father, he opened up the door that led to the kitchen, and as soon as he did, he looked towards the door that led outside and he saw it was wide open. And he saw his dad stepping into this huge cloud of yellow smoke. And amidst this smoke were these cylindrical objects that were floating in the air, spinning around in a circle, seemingly spitting out the smoke. And Raimundo, he had no idea what he was looking at, but he saw his dad just kind of walking into this cloud, and then the smoke got so bad, it totally obscured his dad. His dad was gone. And so Raimundo yelled out for his dad, "Dad, where are you going?" And he charged towards his father to try to stop him. He just felt like, you can't go out there. But as soon as Raimundo went out into the yellow smoke, the smoke just dissipated, the cylinders disappeared, and as soon as it was all gone, his dad was gone too. Raimundo sprinted around his house, calling out for his dad, looking everywhere, but there was no sign of him. And so quickly, Raimundo and his brothers alerted authorities, and they launched the search for him, and for days they combed the area near that boulder as well, and they couldn't find Rivellino. And so eventually, they abandoned the search, and then 6 months later, his body was magically found in that crevice. To this day, nobody knows what actually happened to Rivellino, and how he wound up inside of that rock crevice. Also, people have no idea what that dark figure was skittering across their kitchen floor the night before Rivellino went missing, or who those voices were threatening to kill Rivellino, or the objects that Raimundo apparently saw floating in the sky spitting out yellow smoke. Nobody has any idea what any of that stuff is. All we know is Rivellino disappeared and 6 months later turned up dead in that crevice. Our next story is called the Bennington Triangle. West Townshend is a rural area on the east side of Glastonbury Mountain in the American state of Vermont. This is significant because that places West Townshend in the so-called Bennington Triangle, which is apparently one of the most haunted places in America. The Triangle is a loosely defined area that encompasses the ghost town Glastonbury, which used to be a small logging community centered on the eponymous mountain in southwestern Vermont. The town was abandoned at the end of the 19th century after the logging boom died down, so as a result, the greater Glastonbury area that West Townshend is certainly a part of is now untouched, pristine wilderness that even by Vermont standards is incredibly rugged and remote. The Triangle has earned its spooky reputation due in large part to the alarming number of unexplained disappearances that have occurred there over the last 100 years. Furthermore, over those 100 years, there have been dozens of sightings of the so-called Bennington Monster, which is apparently this 8-foot-tall creature that roams the mountains of Glastonbury, and some people think that creature is behind many, if not all, of these strange disappearances. On November 23, 1943, 37-year-old Carl Herrick and his cousin Henry decided to go to West Townshend to do some deer hunting. At some point during their hunt, the pair got separated, and Henry spent some time yelling for Carl and looking around for him, but he couldn't find him, and so he assumed he must have gone back to their camp. But when Henry got back to camp, it was empty, and Henry waited around for a little while for Carl, but he had this sinking feeling that something was wrong, and so relatively quickly, he left to get police. Police show up, they launch the search. For 3 days, they combed the entire area, and there was just not a sign of Carl anywhere. On the third day, Henry discovered Carl's body. He was lying motionless face down in a clearing in the woods. Initially, Henry thought maybe he was still alive, so he ran over to him and rolled him over, and very quickly realized that no, Carl was deceased. However, there weren't any obvious injuries to Carl's body. He had some minor scratching on his arms and on his hands, but that was about it. Henry looked around the area and he found Carl's rifle that was loaded leaning up against a tree 70 feet away from where Carl was. Next to his rifle on the ground was an expended shell casing. Also, around Carl's body were apparently huge bear tracks. The official cause of death was baffling. Carl, apparently, was squeezed to death to the point where his rib broke and punctured his lung. So the theory became, Carl must have been out here by himself, he encountered a black bear, he fired one shot at the black bear, thinking it was down, he walked over to check, and the bear attacked him and squeezed him and killed him, the end. but not so fast. If Carl encountered a black bear and fired one shot into the animal based on the one found shell casing, that one shot is not going to be enough to put that animal down, or very rarely is one shot going to be enough to put down a black bear. And Carl, being a hunter, he would know that, and he would want to keep some distance with his weapon up aimed at the animal in case he needed to fire again. But even if Carl was really confident that one shot had taken the bear down, well, why would he risk his life by checking on the animal to make sure it's down without his gun? Why did he place it against a tree and then walk 70 feet over to this animal that if it's not dead, it poses an enormous threat to you? You're all alone and unarmed with a huge bear that you've shot? No one's gonna do that. You're gonna carry your gun. But even if all of that happened, that Carl, unarmed, approached this bear thinking it was dead, but the bear's not dead, he's lying in wait, and he leaps up and attacks Carl. Even if that happened, black bears don't squeeze people to death. They might scratch you and bite you and rip you to pieces, but they don't squeeze you to death. And Carl only had light scratching on his wrists and on his hands. He did not have any signs of a traditional bear attack. So either this is the first time in the history of black bears that a black bear squeezed a person to death, or something else squeezed Carl. But what kind of an animal is, one, so strong it can squeeze a man's chest to the point where it breaks his ribs, and two, happens to be roaming around the Bennington Triangle? Makes you wonder. The next and final story of today's episode is called Incommunicado. On the morning of August 18th, 2018, a 41-year-old man named Vladimir Kostenko stepped out of a taxi onto a desolate road in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness, miles and miles from civilization. All he had with him were his cell phone, a solar-powered charger for his phone, and a backpack that contained some clothes and 5 pounds of oatmeal. Vladimir bent down and leaned into the taxi to pay the taxi driver, and as he was doing that, the driver looked up at him and just said, "Are you sure you want to do this?" And Vladimir just smiled and nodded and said, "Yep, I'm going to be just fine. Don't worry about me." Now, the taxi driver did not really buy this and just looked at Vladimir like he was completely insane. But Vladimir wasn't shocked. I mean, this is kind of how everybody reacted to him when he told them about this trip he was doing into the wilderness. You know, when he had brought it up to his family the first time, they and all of their family friends had basically rallied together to try to stop Vladimir from going on this trip. It was way too dangerous. But Vladimir said, "Guys, I'm going. Like, you can't stop me. I'm doing this. It's important to me." And at that point, when, the family and friends knew they couldn't change his mind, they shifted and said, well, at least, bring a gun or bear spray or something to protect yourself. But Vladimir also refused that too. He said, "Nope, I don't need any of that because the only thing I need is God. God is going to protect me." So Vladimir was extremely religious. He actually had left his home country, Russia, when he was in his early 20s because he was being persecuted for his Christian beliefs. And so now, in the United States, he lived out in Washington State and basically lived his life like a monk. I mean, he spent the majority of his time, basically praying and meditating and reading religious books, and he would often go on these multi-day long fasts. He did work part-time as a mechanic, but he rarely charged his clients when he did work. And then even when he did charge them, he was working so few hours that the money he was making was totally unsubstantial. But again, the way Vladimir looked at this is he didn't need money because ultimately God would take care of him. But despite all of his fasting and his praying and, his generosity, lately Vladimir had been feeling really lost. Like, he did feel deeply spiritual, but at the same time, he didn't really feel fulfilled. Like, he felt like he was missing purpose in his life, and it was really starting to bother him. And so it was around this time that Vladimir decided to go on this big trip. One of Vladimir's family friends was this guy named Dmitry Kudrin, and he owned this small cabin way out in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness. Now, Dmitry didn't use this cabin very much, but he kept it in great shape. It was fully furnished, there was a wood-burning stove inside, and the pantry was stocked with 3 years' supply of food. And so at some point, when Vladimir and Dmitry were talking, and Vladimir talked about feeling sort of lost and wanting to reconnect with his spirituality and find his purpose in life, well, at some point, Dmitry said, well, hey, if you want, you can go use my cabin and sort of disconnect from society and go retreat out there and sort of focus on yourself and sort of get right with the world. You're welcome to go out there anytime you want. You can stay out there as long as you want and for free, no problem. and Vladimir had happily accepted. And now here he was, standing on this desolate road in the Alaskan wilderness, watching as the taxi driver drove away, except he wasn't even close to the cabin. I mean, he was in the middle of nowhere already, but he still had to go 14 more miles with no trail to make his way to this cabin. But Vladimir was so excited, he really felt like this was the thing he needed to figure out his purpose in life. And so he put his backpack on, took a deep breath, and began to hike. Three months later, on November 3rd of 2018, Dmitry, Vladimir's friend who owned this cabin, found himself in his plane flying over the area roughly where his cabin was. And Dmitry was feeling very concerned. So obviously, Dmitry suggested Vladimir go out and use this cabin, and so he was totally open to the idea of it. But Dmitry had also told Vladimir that when he went out there, he really ought to bring a gun with him. Or if nothing else, at least some bear spray or something to protect himself, because this is truly the wild. You are not the top of the food chain anymore, and you want to be able to protect yourself. But Vladimir had said no, he would not be going with any sort of weaponry, that, God was going to look after him and he'd be fine. And Dmitry's like, that's a bad plan, but he just could not convince Vladimir to change his mind. And so ultimately, Dmitry sort of regretted even suggesting this idea because he didn't expect Vladimir to go unarmed. But he felt like, it's already in motion. And so he told Vladimir, okay, fine, do your thing. But when you're out there, I need you to communicate with me regularly so I know you're okay. And Vladimir promised he would. And at first, that is exactly what happened. Vladimir, made the 14-mile hike from where he was dropped by the taxi. He got to the cabin, he got all set up. And then just about every other day or every few days, he would hike up this nearby mountain where there was cell phone service, and he would update Dmitry. He would tell him that things were going great. He was spending lots of time meditating and praying, and he was foraging for berries, and there was this pesky squirrel that kept coming in and stealing his food, so he was trying to figure out what to do with the squirrel, but clearly things were going fine, and Vladimir appeared to be safe. However, after 6 weeks of Vladimir being at this cabin, those pretty regular updates just abruptly stopped. Now, at first, Dmitry kind of chalked it up as like, well, I've been talking to him for weeks. There didn't appear to be any, burgeoning crises or anything going on in his life that might warrant some concern. He's a capable guy, maybe because it's the Alaskan winter, and Alaskan winters are notoriously dark. There's not a lot of sunlight. Maybe his solar-powered charger isn't working. He can't get enough sunlight, so he can't charge his phone. And so maybe that's what it is. He just can't contact me because his phone doesn't turn on. Basically, Dmitry was coming up with these sort of rationales for why he wasn't hearing from his friend. But as the days went on and Dmitry still didn't hear from Vladimir, he couldn't help but start to feel like something's wrong here. And so finally, in early November, when Dmitry still had not heard from Vladimir, it's been about a month since those text messages stopped, Dmitry decided to get into his plane and fly out over the area where this cabin was and literally look down and see if his friend was down there in the cabin. Also, this gave Dmitry the opportunity to put some supplies on the plane in these big buckets that he could literally throw out down to Vladimir to also restock him. So Dmitry is now in his plane and he's circling around the area where his cabin is. But this cabin is really small and it's sort of in this big sea of trees. I mean, there's nothing else for miles. And so it's pretty difficult with the naked eye to actually look out and see his own cabin. But Dmitry had this camera on the underside of his plane that he could maneuver and look all around, and he had the screen that he could see from the cockpit that was basically an enhanced view of the ground down below. It was a lot easier to see, for example, his cabin. And so as he was circling, he's moving the camera around, and then bam, he sees right in the middle of his screen is his cabin. And there doesn't appear to be anything wrong with the cabin. It all looks good. There's smoke coming up out of the chimney. And as he's circling, he's thinking, okay, Vladimir clearly is going to hear me. He's going to come outside and I'll see that he's okay. And sure enough, as he's circling around, Dmitry sees on his screen that the front door of the cabin opens and his friend Vladimir walks right outside onto the porch. He puts his hands on his hips and he looks up and he waves at Dmitry. And there's this moment of clear recognition, like obviously Vladimir knows this is Dmitry coming to check on him, and Vladimir's down there kind of gesticulating that, hey, everything's fine, I'm good, sorry about the phone thing, or, Dmitry didn't know what he was doing, but it just sort of seemed like, okay, there's recognition here, that it's been a month, but everything is fine. And so Dmitry got down nice and low and continued to circle, and on one of his passes over the cabin, he pulled a lever, dropped the supplies, those buckets of supplies, they landed down below, and then as Dmitry continued to circle, he watched on the camera as Vladimir walked up and put his hands on the supplies and waved again to Dmitry, sort of signaling, thank you for the supplies. And at that point, Dmitry's thinking, okay, Vladimir's just fine, everything's good, I can go home. And so that's what he did. Now, he would have landed and gone and seen Vladimir up close, but, there wasn't anywhere to land anywhere nearby. Like, this was the closest he could get to Vladimir, and so he decided this was enough. So Dmitry, he turned around and he headed home. But about 2 months later, on December 23rd, Dmitry was once again in his plane flying over the area where his cabin was. Because over these last 2 months, he continued not to get any text messages or any communication from Vladimir, which, that was bad. He sort of expected that, given that Dmitry flew out there before and they clearly recognized, like, hey, are you good? There was sort of a moment of recognition that Dmitry's checking in on Vladimir because of the silence. That's what Dmitry's thinking. Maybe that would inspire Vladimir to find a way to send out communications now, like let Dmitry know he's okay. But he hadn't for 2 months. And so Dmitry's thinking, okay, that's bad. Also, it's now December, and the winter in Alaska is full bore. I mean, tons of snow on the ground, it's frigid temperatures, it is truly brutal winter conditions. And then lastly, there had also just been this major earthquake in the area where Dmitry's cabin was. And so all those things combined made Dmitry think, okay, I better get out there and just check on Vladimir again. And so once again, Dmitry is circling low over the area where his cabin is. He's got his camera trained towards the ground and he's moving it around as he's circling, and eventually he finds his cabin. And his cabin is clearly in one piece, so the earthquake did not destroy his cabin, but there's no sign of Vladimir anywhere. But then again, this is just the first second he's seen the cabin. He's only been in the area for a couple of minutes now. Maybe Vladimir has not heard the plane yet. And so, Dmitry's not lost hope. And he continues to circle. And as he's circling, he drops these supply buckets that land right out in front of the cabin. And at this point, Dmitry's thinking, okay, that's pretty noisy, having these supply buckets smash into the ground outside. Certainly now Vladimir's going to come outside to see what's going on. I mean, there's not much else happening. This clearly is something that would draw his attention. But no, nobody comes out of the cabin. And so at this point, Dmitry gets as low as he possibly can, and he's got his camera trained right at the cabin, and as he's doing another pass, he realizes something. There's no smoke coming out of the chimney. In fact, the top of the chimney is covered with snow, which means clearly no fire has been lit, at least not recently. And so Dmitry starts to panic. Like, if anybody was in that cabin right now without a fire lit, it would be so cold, they would likely freeze to death really quickly. Like, this is a crisis. What's going on with Vladimir? But Dmitry couldn't land anywhere nearby. Like, there was no way for him to really get down to this cabin. So he had to fly all the way to the nearest airport. And then once he touched down, he immediately contacted Alaska State Troopers to report his friend missing, because that was the only thing he could think to do. However, after Dmitry made this report, the state troopers didn't launch some huge search for Vladimir. And that's in part because they weren't actually sure he was missing. They understood that Dmitry, after flying out over the area, had seen snow on the chimney cap and, it's really cold out, like nobody could survive without a fire. And also, he flew over the area, dropped supplies, and Vladimir didn't come out of the cabin. How could he not hear that stuff? They understood that. But they're also thinking it's possible Vladimir just might not have been in the area. Maybe he was out hunting or, foraging for food or whatever he was doing, and maybe he just wasn't in the area. And that's why it gave you the impression that he was missing. And so that was one part of it. And the other part is the weather was atrocious in this part of the world. And so just sending out a search party into the terrible weather out into the wilderness was really risky. And so the troopers thought it just wasn't worth doing this big search. And so instead of launching a big search, the troopers told Dmitry that what they were going to do instead is just comb through airline records, local airline records, to see if maybe a Vladimir Kostenko had, taken off and flown out of the area. Maybe he didn't tell Dmitry and he just left. Maybe that's why he's not there. And this really frustrated Dmitry and the rest of Vladimir's family, because they're all looking at this as a true emergency. And they're thinking, there's no way he just hopped on a plane and flew out of here without telling anyone. And so finally, 3 days after filing this missing person report, Dmitry said, enough is enough. I'm going to just take it into my own hands and go out there myself and see what's going on with Vladimir. So he chartered a private helicopter and he flew out to the cabin. And when he got there, he gets off the helicopter and he just scans the property. and he sees, this little cabin, and there's, firewood outside stacked up with snow all over it. There's loads of snow in the cabin, and there's snow kind of drifted up on the front door, making it seem like nobody's come in or out of this cabin for some time. And, Dmitri, he's looking around for Vladimir, but there's no sign of life anywhere. Dmitri calls out for Vladimir, but there's no response. And so, with some level of trepidation, Dmitri begins walking out towards his cabin. And when he gets close enough to the front door, he notices something weird. He sees that the front door of this cabin has clearly been boarded up from the outside. There's this big piece of metal that's been placed, basically blocking the door, so nobody could go inside of it. And so Dmitri's thinking, why would you do this unless you were leaving the cabin? But why would Vladimir leave the cabin? Where is he? I don't understand what's going on here. And so Dmitri goes up to this piece of metal and pries it off the front door, and then he swings open the front door and he looks inside, and everything is pristine. Vladimir is not inside, but the cabin looks immaculate. There's still firewood, there's still food, there's no sign of chaos, no sign of any struggle whatsoever, everything looks exactly like it should. And so Dmitri, he began walking around inside of this cabin, looking for any clue as to what happened to Vladimir. But there was nothing, until he got to the firewood. He noticed that clearly Vladimir had been labeling his firewood. There was one piece of firewood in particular where the writing was very clear, and what it said was, "Frankincense aroma, do not burn." And so Dmitri's looking at this piece of wood, that's been labeled as something that he shouldn't be burning, and he's looking at other pieces of wood that also have some level of labeling on them, and he's thinking, what does that mean? I don't understand that at all. But that was it. There was no other clues about where Vladimir had gone, and even the labeling of the wood, that didn't give him anything. And so the impression that Dmitri got after seeing this firsthand was that at some point, Vladimir, for reasons completely unknown, just decided to board up the cabin and disappear into the Alaskan wilderness with basically no protection, no clear sign he even brought food with him. He just got up and left. Friends and family, and even some authorities, believe there is a chance he could still be out there somewhere. In fact, at one point, authorities thought they had found Vladimir in Hawaii. It turned out not to be him. And then again, they thought they found him in Oregon. It turned out not to be him as well. But the case is still open, and authorities think, at least some do, that he might be alive somewhere, but nobody knows where. And so at this point, all the family has to go off of is the final image of Vladimir, which was taken from inside of Dmitri's plane when he did that first flyover, and he saw Vladimir come out on the porch. That is the final image of Vladimir that we know of. We don't know what happened after this image. All we know is, at some point he began labeling his firewood, writing down which aroma the wood makes, and then he boarded his place up and he left. But where he went next is still a mystery. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen. Our head of production is Zach Levitt. Produced by Jeremy Bone. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio, Jordan Stidham, and Cole Lacasio. Mixed and mastered by Brendan Kane. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you want to hear more like it, go ahead and check out our YouTube channel, just called MrBallen, where we have hundreds more stories, a lot like this one, but most of them are not available on this podcast. They are only available on that YouTube channel, which again is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature 3 stories about missing people that we just can't explain. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Todd Geib, and it's about a man who goes missing after leaving a party. The second story you'll hear is called 40 Years Later, and it's about a very creepy discovery on a deserted island. And the third and final story you'll hear is called Acid Trip. When help arrives on the scene of a terrible car crash, they discover one person is unaccounted for. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak up behind the follow button and viciously rear naked choke them. Okay, let's get into our first story called Todd Geib. In 2005, Todd Geib was 22 years old. He lived in Michigan. He was an avid outdoorsman. He liked to go deer hunting. He loved to catch trophy fish, and he loved his family. And routinely, after he moved out of the house, he would drive on the weekends the 5 miles north to his parents' house and would spend lots of time with his parents and his extended family. On June 11th, 2005, Todd was visiting his parents at their house. He was there for dinner, and after dinner, he went back to his house. He checked in with his roommate, who was actually his cousin, and then following that, he drove to a local bar to get a few drinks. At about 9:30 that night, he decides to leave the bar and walk to this big orchard where there was this huge annual keg party that he and his friends would go to. He leaves his car at the bar and he walks to this orchard, and it's perfect weather. All of his friends are there. He's having this great time, and he's there all the way until midnight. It was getting late. Todd felt tired, so he told a couple of his friends that he was going to head home. He was going to leave his car at the bar, and he was just going to walk back to his house. The area that this orchard was in was right near his home, and so he knew this area extremely well, and it was only about a mile south to walk to his house. So all of his friends said bye to him. They said he seemed totally normal. They watched him walk south towards his house, and that was the last anybody saw of him. On his walk home, Todd would make 4 phone calls to friends and to family. And the last one he made was at about 12:45 in the morning, and it was to his friends, and he told them that he was in a field and he couldn't breathe. And they kept asking him, like, what are you talking about? And all they heard was very heavy breathing on the phone. They couldn't tell if it was his or if someone else had taken the phone and was now breathing into it. Then the phone cuts out, and they try calling him back, and there was no answer. They couldn't get in touch with him. The next day, when Todd did not show up at a family get-together, something he never would have missed unless he told them ahead of time, his family knew something was wrong. Plus, they had those strange phone calls the night before. They checked in with his friends. They said, yeah, we haven't heard from him. They went over to his house. He wasn't there. And so that's when they called the police. A massive search is kicked off involving canines and helicopters, and they're not finding anything. 3 weeks after Todd had gone missing, a couple was walking around this lake that was located north of the orchard where Todd was at that big keg party. And the wife looked out into the water and she said she thought she saw something bobbing. She couldn't tell what it was, but it was just this weird object that stood out to her. And she and her partner walked down to the edge of the lake and they looked out. And at first she thought it was a person who was swimming, just kind of bobbing up and down because their body position was such that their shoulders and head were totally out of the water. And so it was a strange sight, and they knew that it didn't seem right. So they called the police. Police show up, and it turns out that this person was Todd Geib, and they were deceased. When searchers found out that it was Todd Geib in the lake, their reaction was, no way. We have witnesses saying he was walking south after he left the keg party. Why is he in a lake way to the north of the keg party? It's in the complete opposite direction. Also, investigators were baffled at his body position because if he was a drowning victim, you would expect him to be face down in the water, as most drowning victims are. But for him to be upright, shoulders out of the water, it doesn't make any sense unless there's ice in the water to kind of prop him up. And there wasn't any ice in the water. His toxicology report showed that in addition to alcohol in his system, he had a very high dose of an antidepressant, something that he wasn't prescribed, and he didn't have any history of mental illness and had never been prescribed any antidepressant in his life. His body was pristine. It did not have any of the hallmarks, the bloating you would expect from being in water for 21 days. In fact, it was concluded that it was impossible for his body to have been in the water for all 21 days that he had been missing. His autopsy showed that he had almost no water in his lungs, even though his death was classified as an accidental drowning. When the news broke that this was an accidental drowning, the family and friends pushed for a closer examination of this case because it wasn't adding up. And so a noted pathologist looked at all of the evidence and determined that at most, Todd had been in the water for maybe 3 days, and he had almost certainly been deceased when he was placed in the water, which is why there wasn't any water in his lungs, and it's potentially why he was in that position that he was in, that upright position. Why are we calling it an accidental drowning still? And where was Todd from the day he went missing for those 15 to 17 days before he was placed in the water? And what did he mean when he was on the phone the night he went missing and said he was in a field and couldn't breathe? And what was all that breathing in the background? Lots of questions on this one. Our next story is called 40 Years Later. One of the most remote places in the world is Buldir Island in Alaska. It's 2/3 of the way to Russia along the Aleutian chain of islands. The nearest inhabited island is about 50 miles away. The weather on Buldir Island is pretty brutal, especially during the winter, and there's no electricity there. In 1944, the United States Army decided they wanted to send 5 of their soldiers to monitor the weather station on Buldir Island. That was like the one thing the island was used for. And so one of the people that was sent on this assignment was a guy by the name of Bud Houston. Bud was born in Wisconsin and worked in a shipyard before enlisting in the Army in 1942. He was a big hunter and outdoorsman, and so the prospect of living on this kind of desolate Alaskan island really appealed to him, and he was excited about the assignment. In October of that year, Bud was flown out to Buldir Island, and he met with the other 4 soldiers that were going to be living on the island with him. It was going to be those 5 on the island. No one else is there. And they quickly learned their job of monitoring the weather station was a very low effort job. And so they could do all of their tasks over the course of the day pretty easily, and it freed up a lot of time for them to explore the island. And that would actually become their favorite pastime because there really wasn't much else to do there except explore the island. And so very quickly, they became very familiar with the whole island because it wasn't that big. It was about maybe 2.5 miles wide by 4.5 miles long. On March 3rd, 1945, so 5 months after they've arrived on Buldir Island, so by now they know every square inch of the island, they're very comfortable here, they had to do a routine patrol around the weather station. This was something they did multiple times a week, so very routine. And all 5 of them are sitting in the weather station, and Bud says he'll do it. So Bud gets his rifle, and he heads outside to do this patrol. And the other 4 are just sitting in the weather station, and after about an hour, they realize Bud hasn't come back yet. And this patrol does not take more than 20 minutes. And so they step outside to see if he's out there, and the weather at the time was very mild. You know, there's no snow on the ground, it's not very cold, it's not very windy, and the visibility this night was pretty good. And so they're looking out over the island, and the island has no trees. At the very far end, at the opposite end of where the weather station is, there's one significant sized mountain. But short of that, it's not particularly mountainous. So from their perspective, they could look out over the island and basically see everything. And they don't see him anywhere. At first, they were not that worried about it because they figure, you know what, he knows what he's doing. He's been here so long. He's probably just out exploring or something. But they decided they would go look for him. They go down to the water. He's not down there. They walk all around the far side of the island. They can't find him. And so by the time they get back to the weather station, they were like, we have to tell the command that we've lost him. So they radio back to higher command and they say, we don't know where he went. He went out on patrol and we didn't hear anything. And now he's gone. And so a whole bunch of reinforcements came out to the island to look on foot with the other 4 soldiers, as well as planes and helicopters. And for 2 days, they looked all over that island for Bud, and they couldn't find him. And you got to remember that there's very few places you could possibly even go on the island that they wouldn't be able to look and see you. And so everyone started to think he must have jumped into the water or fallen into the water because there's nowhere for him to hide on the island. And so after a couple of days, they were so sure that it was just not possible for him to be on the island that they called the search off and they said he must have fallen into the water. Fast forward 40 years to 1988, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service was studying birds on Buldir Island, and they made this amazing discovery. This crew had set up their camp at 1,600 feet of elevation on the one large mountain on the far side of the island, basically on the opposite end of the island from the weather station. And one of the crew members happened to just walk around one of the boulders, and they looked down and there was this little tiny crevice between the boulder and the ground, and he thought he saw something inside of it. And he got down and he looked and he realized there was a skeleton that had been kind of crammed into this tiny little tight space. And the skeleton had a military uniform on. It had been kind of balled up, but there was a uniform on what was left of the skeleton, and there was also a rifle that had been jammed down in there as well. And it would turn out to be Bud Houston. So why did Bud say he was going to go outside and do that patrol, which really just meant walking around the immediate vicinity of the weather station? You're certainly not traveling very far. Why did he say he was going to do that and then walk 4.5 miles to the other end of the island and then climb up 1,500 feet to the top of this mountain? But even if he had a reason to be over there, why would he then force himself into this little tiny crevice? If he was looking for shelter, well, the weather was incredibly mild. It would not have been life-threatening to be out in the elements, at least not that first night or even that second night. And he knows the island like the back of his hand. He probably had a little bit more time. He probably could have found a better place for shelter than this awful little crevice. But if he was at a place where he was seeking shelter under these boulders instead of just walking back to the weather station and getting real shelter, then he had to have been in an emergency situation. That's the only way that makes sense. But if he was in an emergency situation, he would know that his responsibility is not just to survive, it's also to be found again, and to make sure you're not obscured underneath a boulder so no one can find you. This island, it was like the easiest place to be found. There's no trees, there was helicopters overhead and planes, and there's all these people. It's a small space. All he had to do was not be under the boulder 24/7. Maybe during the day when the weather let up, roll out from under the boulder, let yourself be found. But that's not what happened. What probably happened is Bud somehow got crammed into that little tiny crevice almost immediately after he left the weather station to do that patrol. But logically speaking, he would not do that to himself, so someone else had to do it. But all the other people on the island were in the weather station at the time this would have been happening. So it really makes you wonder, what happened when he walked outside of that weather station? Who or what did he see, and what did they do to him? Unfortunately, we'll probably never know.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Acid Trip.
On the evening of June 24th, 1986, a 10-year-old boy named Juan Pedro Martinez Gomez bounced around in his seat and smashed his toy cars together in the cab of his father's big red tractor-trailer truck. Juan was so excited he could barely sit still. He always wanted to go for a ride in his dad's big truck. His dad was a long-haul trucker, but his dad always said no. But Juan had just gotten his best report card ever, and so as a reward for doing so well in school, Juan's father had surprised Juan and Juan's mom with this particular trip. Their plan was to drive from their hometown in southeastern Spain all the way across the country to the northern coast. And then once they got there, Juan's dad would offload the cargo that he had driven there. Juan and his mom and dad would stick around and kind of make a vacation out of it, going to the beaches and checking out the beautiful pastures where all the cows would graze. I mean, Juan was super excited. Juan's dad pulled the truck into this big lot with all these other trucks around, and then Juan's dad turned around and began backing the truck up so it could be paired up with the cargo he'd be hauling to the north coast. It was this huge 25,000-liter tanker that was covered in all these stickers and warning labels. And, Juan's father didn't know what this tanker actually contained, but he could tell, whatever it was pretty dangerous and also very important. And so as Juan's dad is backing up skillfully to line up with this tanker, Juan is just sitting in the back seat, absolutely transfixed at how cool his dad is. I mean, this is like the most amazing thing Juan had ever seen. And so finally, Juan's dad successfully hitched the truck to the tanker. And so once they were all hooked up, Juan's father yelled out the window and said bye to the people he worked with. And then Juan's father put in Juan's favorite tape cassette into the stereo and turned the music up. And then he turned onto the road and began making his way toward the highway. Juan's dad would drive basically all night, and Juan and his mother would basically sleep all night. But they would wake up at about 5 a.m. when Juan's father pulled into the parking lot of a diner that was located just north of the city of Madrid, Spain. They were making great time, so Juan's father told his family they could take their time eating. When the family did finish their meals, they got up and began walking out towards the truck, and little Juan, he turned around and he waved to the waitresses, and they all waved back. And then the family climbed back into Juan's father's truck, and then before long, Juan was curled up in the back seat trying to fall asleep again as his father merged onto the highway and began heading towards the stretch of mountain road called the Somosierra Mountain Pass. About 40 minutes later, a man who was also driving in the Somosierra Mountain Pass was just driving along when suddenly a huge red tractor-trailer truck came barreling toward him from behind, shining their lights into his car. And so this man, he sees this truck approaching so quickly, and he tried to get out of the way, but there was nowhere to go, and the truck wasn't stopping, it was honking its horn, and the truck smashed into this guy, which sent his car careening off the road, but luckily it did not tumble all the way down the mountain. And so this guy's car comes to a stop on the side of the road, and the guy, he kind of comes to, and he feels himself, he's worried he's got a serious injury. He did find a little blood on his head, but overall, he felt he was okay. And then he managed to get his door open and he climbed out of his car and he looked a little ways down the road and there was the truck that had hit him. It was now on its side and it was hissing steam and it didn't look like anybody inside the truck was trying to get out. Now, even though this guy was pretty shaken up from the crash he had just gotten into, he felt like he was definitely in better shape than whoever was in this truck. And so he decided he would just go up there and try to help them. But after only taking a few steps, this white van came blazing around the corner and came to a screeching stop on the road right next to where this guy was. And then before the guy could do anything, the sliding door to the van flung open and this woman with blonde hair jumped out and she ran over to him and she said, "I'm a nurse. Do you need any help?" And so this guy, he's looking at this woman and he's kind of sizing her up and she did not seem like a nurse. And in fact, for some reason, this guy felt like she just made him really uncomfortable. He couldn't quite put his finger on it. And then he looked past this woman at the van and he saw the driver looked oddly similar to the woman, except it was a man who was driving, but he also had very bright blonde hair and he had these striking blue eyes that really stood out even from a distance. And then in the passenger seat of this van was this elderly woman who was just staring daggers at this guy who's now talking to this nurse who's right next to him. And so the guy's looking at the old woman and the old woman's looking right back and she really looked mean, like she was not happy to be talking to him. And so the guy finally just said to this woman who was claiming to be a nurse that, "You know what? I don't need any help. Go help them. They need help because they haven't gotten out of the truck yet." The woman just nodded and then she ran back to the van, hopped inside, and the van sped, the 100 feet down the road to where the crashed big red tractor trailer truck was. And again, the woman hopped out and she rushed over to the truck and she climbed on top of it and she reached down and she took something out of the truck. But from his perspective, 100 feet back, the guy who had also crashed, he couldn't tell what she had taken out of the cab. But after she took whatever she took, she climbed off the cab. She did not attempt to help anybody inside of the truck. She jumped back in the white van and the white van sped off down the road and they were gone. The guy barely had time to process what had just happened before he began to smell this unbelievably powerful rotten egg smell. When help arrived, emergency responders immediately realized they had an environmental disaster on their hands. The big red tractor-trailer truck, which was Juan's father's truck, was hauling 25,000 liters of sulfuric acid. And that rotten egg smell they were smelling in the area meant the air was now becoming toxic as the sulfuric acid leaked out and began interacting with the ground and making its way into the nearby river. So before anybody could even go inside of this truck to see if there were survivors, they had to basically cover it and the surrounding areas with hundreds and hundreds of pounds of sand and lime to try to counteract the acid. It would take hours to do this, and in that time, nobody came out of the truck's cab. And then finally, when emergency crews were able to go up to the truck and look inside, they discovered that the vehicle's occupants were all dead. However, there were only two bodies. It was Juan's mother and father. Juan was nowhere to be found. Now, one of the theories was, when this crashed, maybe the sulfuric acid landed on Juan's body somehow and literally dissolved him. And so that's why he was not found. But that's not possible because it would take much, much longer for sulfuric acid to totally eat away someone's body. And the body would have to be fully submerged in the acid the entire time. So that could not have happened. Rescuers would search the entire area deep into the woods in all directions, looking for signs of this child, but there were none. And when investigators attempted to recreate this accident to try to figure out what actually caused it and why it happened, what they would learn would only confuse them more. Juan's father's truck had nothing wrong with it mechanically, meaning the brakes weren't messed up, the accelerator wasn't messed up. There really was no reason why this truck should have crashed unless it was intentional. That's the only way this could have happened. Also, the truck contains something called a tachometer, which registers every time the truck slows down or stops. And when investigators looked at the record from this tachometer, they discovered that Juan's father had slowed down or stopped 12 different times between leaving the diner and crashing. But the route from the diner to the crash site was a straight shot with no traffic lights or stop signs. Basically, there had been no reason from the diner to the crash site to ever slow down or stop. But again, Juan's father did 12 separate times. And then also there were traces of heroin that were found in a hidden compartment in Juan's father's truck. Now, Juan's parents had no criminal record and absolutely no connection to drugs or the cartel, but investigators did consider a theory that, perhaps a drug cartel ambushed Juan and his family, and ultimately Juan was kidnapped. But there was one more really strange element to Juan's disappearance, and that was that white van that guy saw right after the crash. Multiple people in the area around the Somosierra Mountain Pass said they saw that exact white van because they all remembered the woman and the man who had that same really bright blonde hair. It just was something that was kind of unique and stood out. But the police tried to track down this van and the man and the woman and the elderly woman who was also claimed to have been seen inside the van, but no trace of that van was ever found. And also, police were never able to figure out what that woman actually took from inside of Juan's father's cab before they sped off and disappeared. Missing person posters of Juan went up all over Spain, and almost immediately, loads of sightings were reported of Juan. But every time the police followed up on these sightings, they never panned out. Interpol, which is a major international police organization, called Juan's disappearance one of the strangest disappearances in all of Europe. 1 year after the crash, so in 1987, a driving instructor in Madrid, Spain, was filling out some paperwork in his office when he heard a knock on the door. When he answered the door, he found there was this elderly woman who appeared to be blind, and with her was a young boy who appeared to be about 11 years old. The driving instructor asked them, how can I help you? And he watched as the elderly woman turned and whispered something into the little boy's ear. And the driving instructor, he could hear her whispering, but he couldn't understand what she was saying. It sounded like a foreign language. And in fact, it would turn out they figured out she was speaking Farsi, which is the language spoken in Iran. The little boy listened to the elderly woman, and then after hearing what she had to say, he turned to the driving instructor and he asked in perfect Spanish, "Where's the U.S. Embassy?" The instructor gave them directions, and then the little boy nodded, and then he and the elderly woman, they turned around, they grabbed each other's hands, and they began walking away. And as they walked away, the driving instructor, he just couldn't help but feel like there was something oddly familiar about these two people. And so he flagged them down, and he said, "Come back for a second." And so the boy and the woman, they came back, and the driving instructor, he asked the boy, he said, "Do you live in Spain? And if you do, how long have you lived here for?" And when he asked the boy this, the boy immediately looked really afraid. And then the elderly woman, she turned and she whispered something else into the boy's ear. And then after she was done talking, the boy kind of settled down and he looked at the driving instructor and he said, 6 months. And for some reason, at this exact moment, the driving instructor realized why this boy seemed so familiar. He remembered seeing him on all those missing person posters all over the place. And so the driving instructor, he couldn't remember the boy's name. And he goes, "Hold on a minute." He turns and he runs inside of his office and he finds one of the posters that said Juan Pedro Martinez Gomez. He grabbed it and he ran back out to show it to them and be like, "Hey, they're looking for you." But when the driving instructor came back to the front door, the boy and the blind old woman were gone. And so the driving instructor, he stepped out, he's looking around, he's yelling out for them. They were gone. Now, it's important to understand that to this day, no sightings of Juan have ever been confirmed, and that includes the driving instructor who claimed to have seen Juan. But to this day, Juan's body has never been found, he's still missing, and his case is still unsolved.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts, not just this one, but also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, and Runful. Just search for Ballen Studios on any podcast platform, and you'll find all of them. If you want to watch hundreds more strange, dark, and mysterious stories, just head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.
Today's podcast will feature 2 stories about unexplainable phenomena. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Two-Faced, and it's about a man who's filled with this deep sense of foreboding after a ghastly sight in his mirror. And the second and final story you'll hear is called Make It Rain, and it's about an inmate who has a truly unbelievable ability. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So, if that's of interest to you, please invite the follow button to come with you to a big costume party. But don't tell them you're actually going to a funeral. Okay, let's get into our first story called Two-Faced. On the night of November 7th, 1860, a 51-year-old American politician walked inside of his modest 2-story home in Springfield, Illinois. This politician was totally exhausted, but he was also really happy because in his hand he had a telegram that confirmed he had won an election that he had worked so hard for and he wasn't sure he was going to get. And so earlier that night, this politician had been out basically partying and celebrating this huge victory, but now he was totally beat and ready for bed. Once the politician was inside his house, he picked up an oil lamp to light the way, and he walked through his house to his study, where he put the lamp down on his desk. He put the telegram saying he had won this election next to the lamp, and then the politician just collapsed into his sofa to fall asleep. But before he closed his eyes, this politician looked over at a mirror on the wall, and what he saw in the mirror made him gasp, and he sat upright and looked at it like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. In this mirror, this politician was seeing his own face, reflected as it should be, but then next to it was another face, and it was not his. It kinda looked like him, but it actually looked more like a corpse, like a dead person was looking out at him from this mirror. And so the politician, he stood up and began walking over to the mirror to get a closer look, but as he got closer, the dead person's face disappeared and all was left was his own reflection. And so he's like, okay, I must have been dreaming that, that can't have been real. And so feeling very unsettled, this politician just went back over to the couch and he laid back down thinking, okay, just forget about that, go to sleep. But again, he glanced over at the mirror, and now that he was laying down again, he saw the 2 faces again, his own and this dead person's face. And at this point, he stood up and rushed out of the room into his bedroom where his wife was. Now, his wife was a very devoted spiritualist, and so the politician thought maybe he could tell her about what he saw in the mirror, and she could interpret it and tell him what it meant. And so he sat down and he told his wife about what he had just seen, and she would sit there for a minute pondering what her husband had just said, and then her expression on her face just totally changed. She went from intrigued to very upset, and in a quivering voice, she would tell her husband that what this meant was he would serve honorably in the office that he had just been elected to for 1 term, he would get re-elected, but he would not survive the 2nd term. Now, when the politician heard this, he immediately rejected it. And he said to his wife, there's no way that's true. I probably didn't even see a face in the mirror. I'm probably just so tired, I imagined what I saw. So let's just forget about it. But his wife was not consoled, and she fell into his arms sobbing as if he had just been diagnosed with some fatal illness. And over the next several days and weeks and months, this politician's wife continued to be so upset about this potential death omen that the politician had apparently had, even though, again, the politician is constantly telling his wife, come on, there's no way that's actually going to happen. And sure enough, over time, the politician's wife did sort of stop being so scared all the time that her husband was going to die. And the politician himself, he just kind of forgot about what he had seen in the mirror that night. So he would go on to serve his first term in this elected office. He would be reelected for a second term. And then during his second term, on April 14th, 1865, this politician and his wife were out at a play in Washington, D.C. And during the last act of the play, a man named John Wilkes Booth famously snuck up behind Abraham Lincoln, who was this elected politician. He was the president of the United States in his second term. And John Wilkes Booth shot Abraham Lincoln in the back of the head, killing him. And so, Abraham Lincoln would indeed not survive his second term, just like the mirror death omen had predicted. The next and final story of today's episode is called Make It Rain. On February 24th, 1983, a 21-year-old man named Don Decker walked into a funeral home in the tiny rural town of Stroudsburg, Pennsylvania, where Don's grandfather's funeral was being held. And as soon as Don walked inside, he saw his grandfather's casket open for viewing at the front of the room, and then he also saw lots of his family members and friends of his grandfather kind of kneeled around the casket and, sitting in the front seats of this funeral home, and everybody is quietly crying and kind of consoling each other. But Don, he walks in and he doesn't talk to anybody in his family, doesn't talk to any of the friends, he doesn't go up to his grandfather's casket. Instead, Don sat down in the very last row of seats, he folded his arms and just scowled angrily as he looked around the room. Unlike everybody else inside of this funeral home, Don was not remotely sad. He was instead just totally angry. In fact, as he was sitting there, he was clenching his fists so hard out of fury that his fingernails were practically cutting into his skin. Don had come to this funeral home directly from the Monroe County Correctional Facility, where he was serving a 4 to 12-month sentence for receiving stolen property. The jail had granted Don a furlough, which is a temporary leave of absence, so he could go to his grandfather's funeral. And Don had jumped at the opportunity, mostly just to get out of jail for a minute, but now that he was actually at the funeral, he kind of regretted going. Eventually, the actual funeral began, and one by one, Don's family members would go up to the podium and say something nice about the grandfather, and then sit back down. And at first, Don, he put up with it, but after a couple people had spoken, Don was just livid. He just couldn't hear any more. And so he tried to focus his attention just on his grandfather's casket, where he could literally see his grandfather's face as he was laying there. And as he was staring at his grandfather's face, suddenly Don saw something and he stood up really suddenly in his seat. And in fact, when he stood up, it immediately caught the attention of the speaker, which was Don's cousin. And the cousin just stopped and stared at Don. And at that point, the rest of the people in the funeral also turned around and looked at Don. And Don, he knew people were looking at him, but he didn't care anymore. He was now so focused on his grandfather because a second ago, he could have sworn he saw his grandfather's lips moving like he was still alive. But as Don continued to stare at his grandfather, expecting his lips to move again, they didn't. And so finally, Don didn't say a word to all these people who were still staring at him, and he just turned and stalked out of the funeral home. Once Don was outside, he thought for a second about heading to the home where he knew his whole family would be going after the funeral, but Don just could not face being around that crowd again, and so instead, he headed to his friend's home. It was this couple named Bob and Jeannie Kiefer, and the reason Don wanted to see them is he knew they were just kind of laid-back people who would not ask him a lot of questions, and they would just kind of let him have some peace and quiet. And really all Don wanted between now and 2 days from now, when he had to go back to jail when his furlough ended, was just to have some peace and quiet. And so Don made his way to their house, and when he got there, Bob and Jeannie were so excited to see him. They called him inside and said, hey, we're gonna make dinner, go wash up and relax, and we'll eat together. Don didn't say much, but, he nodded a thank you, he went inside, and right away he went upstairs to the bathroom and splashed some cold water on his face because still, Don just could not shake that anger he was feeling when he was inside the funeral home. And for a second, the splashing of water on his face seemed to be working. He felt like his whole body was getting cooler. In fact, the whole bathroom seemed to have this coolness descend on it. But a weird thing started to happen. Don, as he's feeling this kind of cool come over him, he realized it was actually getting so cold in the bathroom, literally, like physically cold in the bathroom, that it was becoming uncomfortable, like he was cold. And then when Don just happened to look up at the mirror right in front of him, he could have sworn for a second he saw on the edge of the mirror the face of an old man wearing a gold crown. And immediately Don, he kind of freaked out and turned around, but there was nothing there. And as he's like shivering from the cold from being in this bathroom, he began looking all around him, trying to find this old man with a crown on his head, but obviously there was nothing in the bathroom with him. And so Don felt totally unsettled by this. He didn't understand why it was so cold. He didn't know what he had just seen. And then Don happened to look down at his wrists, and he saw there were these deep scratches all over both of his wrists. And so kind of in a panic, Don just rolled his sleeves down to cover up whatever was on his wrists. He didn't want to think about it. He turned off the water and sprinted out of that freezing cold bathroom and just made his way downstairs where Bob and Jeannie were just sitting down for dinner. So Don, he took his seat, he got his food, and he didn't tell Bob or Jeannie about anything that had just happened up in the bathroom. He just sat there and ate in silence. Now, Bob and Jeannie could clearly tell something was on Don's mind, but they'd known him for years, and they knew he was just not the type to come out and talk about anything personal. He basically completely kept to himself, and then when he spoke, he was kind of oddly flat and monotone and emotionless. That was just who he was. But, he didn't cause any problems. He was a very nice guy. And so, for this entire meal, Bob and Jeannie just kind of looked at Don, but didn't ask him any questions and just let him eat in peace. After the trio was done eating, Jeannie gathered up their dishes and headed to the kitchen to wash up, and Bob and Don headed to the living room where they sat down and Bob turned on the TV, and for a few minutes the two friends just watched TV. But at some point, Bob realized when he looked over at Don that Don was not really looking at the TV. He was actually looking down at the ground. It was like he was just sitting there motionless, just staring off into space. And Bob thought to himself, wow, Don must be catatonic with grief here from losing his grandfather. But Bob, he felt really bad for Don, but he had no idea what to say to him. He knew Don was not about to launch into some deep story about how he was feeling. And so Bob just sat there and said nothing, hoping that, just his physical presence next to Don was comforting in some way to Don during this really difficult time. And so a few minutes goes by, and the two men are still silently sitting in their seats, when Bob begins to hear what sounds like running water. And at first, he looked over at Don, thinking maybe Don had spilled a drink on the ground, but Don didn't have a drink. Don was still just sitting there catatonic, staring at the ground in front of him. And then, Bob, he turned and looked towards the kitchen, thinking maybe Jeannie had spilled a drink, but she didn't appear to have done that. And then Bob felt a drop of water land on his head. And so he looked up and he saw water was coming through the ceiling. And so right away, Bob stood up and he yelled to his wife that a pipe had burst. And then Bob, he grabbed his phone and he called his landlord, who lived right nearby, and said, you got to get over here. There's a pipe that's burst in your house. And just a couple of minutes later, the landlord and his wife arrived at the house. The landlord ran inside and he and Bob rushed upstairs to try to find the origin of this leak. And when they got up there, they looked everywhere and there was no obvious sign of where water could be leaking from. The toilet wasn't overflowing, neither was the sink. They couldn't hear the sound of running water anywhere. And then they also realized as they're walking around upstairs that where the leak was coming through the ceiling above the living room, they went to that rough area above the living room. And the landlord was like, there's no plumbing over this area. There should be absolutely no water anywhere near where the water was coming through. And so Bob and the landlord were very confused, and they began walking downstairs to try to figure out what else they could do. And when they walked downstairs, two things happened very quickly. The first was, as they came down the stairs, they were entering the living room where the leak had originally been noticed. And when they walked back into the living room, they saw right away that this leak had grown, and it was now not just coming out of the ceiling of the living room, but it was also now leaking out of the walls of the living room. Basically, all the different walls and surfaces in the living room were leaking water. And then the second thing they noticed was Dawn. Dawn was still sitting on the couch, still just totally catatonic, staring at the ground, not doing anything, which made no sense. Everybody else in the house is running around trying to figure out this leak, and there's Dawn just staring at the ground. And so Bob, who at this point is pretty overwhelmed with what's happening here, but he thought, I gotta make sure Dawn's okay. And so he just walked through the leaking living room right over to Dawn, and he said, Dawn, are you okay? And Dawn, he didn't say anything, he didn't move, but his mouth kind of contorted into this weird smile with his lips kind of pulling away from his teeth, and all the tendons on the top of his hands began to tense as he wiggled his fingers. And Bob, at this point, he realized there's something wrong with Dawn, and they needed to call the police. A couple of minutes later, two police officers named John Bojan and Richard Wolbert arrived at Bob and Jeannie's house. And so they came inside, and Bob quickly tried to explain what was going on. But John and Richard, they walked inside and immediately saw, okay, something totally weird is happening here. Because they looked into the living room and they saw water coming down from the ceiling, coming out of the walls. It was even bubbling up all over the floor. And in the middle of all this chaos was one person, Don, who's just sitting there totally erect, not moving, wiggling his fingers with this weird expression on his face. And the police very quickly said to Bob that we don't know what this is. We don't even know how to help. So we're going to get our police chief. And as soon as those officers left, it was like Bob, Jeannie, the landlord, the landlord's wife, they were now scared to be in this house. Before, it was just baffling. But now, with Don sitting there tapping his fingers with that weird grimace on his face and water coming out of everywhere for no reason, it was like terrifying. And so the four of them just kind of huddled in the dining room staring at Don and the living room until finally the two officers came back with their police chief. But once the chief came inside, things did not get any better. Because the chief walked inside and he saw how totally weird this was, but his reaction was, this is not a police problem. You clearly have some sort of totally weird plumbing issue that seems very extensive, and your friend, he seems okay, he's just acting really weird. And so the chief told his two officers, John and Richard, to not talk about what they saw in this house and just leave, don't report it, get out of here, we're done with this. And just like that, John, Richard, the police chief, they said, okay guys, your problem, and they left. And then Bob and Jeannie's landlord was like, okay, we're going to get a plumber over here right away, and you can deal with this. And then they left. And so Bob and Jeannie at this point are totally unsettled, and they just stood in the dining room staring over at the living room where Don was just sitting there tapping his fingers, water's leaking all around him. And then finally a plumber came to the house and they searched the whole house and they could not find anywhere where there was a leak. It literally didn't make sense that the living room was still leaking water. And so Bob, he contacted his landlord and said, what do you want me to do? And the landlord said, you know what? I don't know. We'll send out more plumbers tomorrow. We'll figure it out. And so Bob and Jeannie, they just put out as many towels and blankets as they could all over the living room, doing their best to kind of sop up the water. The whole time they're glancing over at Don, who's still not moving, tapping his fingers, sitting on the couch. And then finally, after Bob and Jeannie had exhausted their towel and blanket supply trying to sop up all this water, they're like, what can we even do? It's still leaking. We can't stop it. We don't know what's going on with Don. And so the couple just sat in the dining room, staring into the living room, basically at Don, just kind of waiting for him to maybe break out of his trance. And eventually Don would, break out of his trance, kind of. Instead of, suddenly standing up and talking to Bob and Jeannie, he just eventually kind of dozed off, still in the upright sitting position. And so at this point, Bob walked over to Don just to check on him and make sure he was breathing and that he was okay. And so he checked and, he was, Don was okay. But Bob noticed that on Don's neck were all these dark red scratches and marks, like someone had been strangling him. And then also on the inside of Don's collar was a little bit of blood. And so Bob, he calls over Jeannie and he's like, what do you make of this? And she's like, I don't know. This whole thing, I don't know what's going on here. And so the couple decided they would just go to bed. Don seems like he's okay. He's sleeping on the couch. We can't fix the water, so that's all we can do. And so the couple, they went upstairs, they went to bed, and the next morning when they came back down, the living room was still leaking, and Don was wide awake again, back in that sitting position, tapping his fingers with this bizarre grimace on his face. And all day that day, and all day the next day, that's where Don would stay, in that position, only stopping to fall asleep, still in that position. And over those 2 days, all these plumbers and different people came over to the house, and nobody could figure out where this leak was coming from. And so the water just continued to pool inside of the living room. And then finally, on February 26th, so 2 days after Don had arrived at Bob and Jeannie's house, Don suddenly stood up. He didn't say a word to Bob or Jeannie. He just walked out of the house. And as soon as he did, all the water that was leaking out of the ceiling and the walls stopped. Don would go back to prison, and when he walked into his cell, his cellmate took one look at Don, and apparently the look on Don's face was so unsettling that the cellmate immediately called over one of the guards and said, you gotta get me out of the cell. I can't be in here with this guy. And so this cellmate and the guard, they both turned and looked at Don, and Don, he was at the back of the cell and he was facing both of them. And when they looked at Don, that totally weird grimace came across his face, the same one he had on as he sat in Bob and Jeannie's house for those 2 days. It was the same expression. And with that expression on his face, in this totally creepy kind of hollow voice, he says to the two men, I can make it rain. Now, the cellmate was terrified of Don and was practically screaming for the guard to let him leave the cell, but the guard, who was definitely unsettled by Don and his behavior, he was less scared and more just kind of intrigued with what Don had just said, and he said, okay, hey Don, if you can make it rain, then why don't you make it rain in the warden's office? And after the guard said this, Don's expression, that kind of creepy, weird smile he had, it grew larger and larger until he had this totally bizarre smile on his face, exposing all of his teeth. At this point, the guard now felt totally terrified of Don and understood why the cellmate was so scared of him, and kind of instinctively, the guard just turned and ran into the warden's office to tell the warden what was going on with this guy. But when he got into the warden's office, he looked at the warden, Dave Keenhold was his name, and he was sitting at his desk doing some paperwork, and Dave looked up at the guard, and the guard realized on Dave's chest, his shirt, there was this wet spot that was growing slowly all over his chest, and it was almost like the warden didn't realize it was happening. And so Dave looks up at the guard and he's like, what's going on? And the guard, he just points at Dave's chest and says, look! And so the guard told the warden about what he had just witnessed in the jail cell and how he had kind of jokingly told Don to make it rain in the warden's office, and now there's this wet patch on your shirt, what's going on here? And the warden, he looked down and he was just as caught off guard by this wet spot on his shirt, and so he leapt up and he and the guard ran back to Don's jail cell, and when they got there, they couldn't believe what they saw. Water was pouring out of the ceiling, it was coming out of the ground, even the bars were leaking water, and there was Don in the back of the jail cell, standing there with that terrible smile on his face, and his fingers were contorting, all the tendons were all tight in his hand, and his cellmate was practically crying, huddled in the corner. And so right away, Warden Keenhold moved the cellmate out of that cell, put him in another cell, and then shut the cell where Don was, and then the warden called a plumber to come out here and stop this leak from wherever it was coming from. But the plumber came to the jail, and no matter where he looked, he could not find anything that would cause this leak inside of this jail cell. It just didn't make sense. And in fact, the plumber was so scared of Don, who the whole time this inspection is happening, he's standing in the back wiggling his fingers with this bizarre look on his face. The plumber was so scared of Don that after he told the warden that he couldn't find a leak, he just left without even being paid. He just had to get away from Don. Now, Warden Keenhold had no idea what was happening with Don, but he could tell it was well beyond his own expertise, and frankly, he had no idea who he should call about what was going on. And so he just called the jail's minister and asked him to come over and see what was going on. But when the Reverend got there and saw Don and saw all the water in the cell, he too had no idea what to do. But when the Reverend walked up to the bars to get a closer look at Don, Don began to move in the cell as well towards the Reverend. And Don, he would stop about halfway through the cell, and when he did, the Reverend stopped as well, and they were kind of looking at each other, and then Don, he raised up his right arm into the air. And when he did, more and more water began pouring into the cell, and also this terrible rotting smell filled the entire jail. It smelled like death. And the Reverend, he was horrified by it, and Don, he was just grinning with his arm up, and then he brought his arm down and began rubbing his hands together and just staring at the Reverend. At this point, the Reverend grabbed his Bible and began reading passages accusing Don of being possessed by Satan, and he was reading all these passages from the Bible to try to banish this evil spirit from Don. And then suddenly Don just let out this horrible guttural scream that was so loud, the Reverend had to stop and cover his ears, and so did the warden and the guard and the cellmate. And then after he let out this horrible scream, it was like Don snapped back to reality and he just collapsed on the ground and began sobbing. It would take Don a long time to finally open up about what the heck had just happened to him, but he would eventually open up to his friends Bob and Jeannie. And while his explanation for what he went through did explain some aspects of what occurred between February 24th and 26th of 1983, it did not explain everything. Don and his grandfather had been very close. However, when Don was just 7 years old, his grandfather began abusing him physically. Don had kept the violence a secret for his entire life, but he had come to view his grandfather as the human embodiment of evil. And so when his grandfather passed away, Don frankly was relieved to find out his grandfather was dead. But when he went to the funeral and he saw all of his loved ones talking about his grandfather as being this incredible person, so loving, so kind, it totally infuriated Don. And as he felt this anger growing inside of him, Don could have sworn he saw his dead grandfather's lips move. And at the time, Don had no idea what to make of it, but he would later say that he believes that was the moment that his evil grandfather's spirit basically possessed him. And Don would say when he got to Bob and Jeannie's house, he began to feel like there was something wrong with him, but he couldn't stop whatever it was. It was like there was somebody else in his brain making him do and say things that he didn't want to do, but he just couldn't stop it. And so he had gone upstairs to the bathroom in Bob and Jeannie's house, hoping to splash some water on his face and make himself feel better. And that was when he saw that old man's face. Well, that face was his grandfather's face. He was wearing that crown. And Don would say he thinks the reason he was wearing a crown is because it signified he had all the power over Don. And then also Don had those scratches on his wrists, which he thought was his grandfather as well. He went downstairs and tried to tell himself that everything was okay. But after Don sat down on the couch, he said he couldn't move anymore. It was like his grandfather had totally took over, and he locked him on the couch with that bizarre contorted expression, and he kept moving Don's hands around. And then obviously the water began leaking in the room for no reason, which Don says was entirely his grandfather. He was just trying to scare all of Don's friends and Don himself. It was his way of tormenting Don a little bit more. And then again at the jail, when the same scene kind of unfolded, Don believed it was his evil grandfather inflicting just a little bit more pain and torment. For almost a decade after this happened, everybody involved in this didn't really talk about it publicly. Especially the police and the jailers, they did not talk about what they witnessed because they were worried talking about it publicly would make them look like crazy people and they'd get fired. But eventually, in the 90s, 9 people, including 4 police officers and the jail warden, would officially go on the record and testify to what they saw happening. And it would include Don seeming totally deranged and in a trance-like state as water just poured into these rooms that he was in. To this day, we do not have an explanation for what happened to Don. The only explanation that seems to make sense is that Don really was possessed by his evil grandfather. Also, it should be noted that Don never made it rain again. The only times that happened were in Bob and Jeannie's house and in that jail cell from February 24th to February 26th, 1983. After that, Don lived a totally normal life.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. The MrBallen Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Locasio, research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Locasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen Podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's podcast will feature 2 stories about unexplainable phenomena. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Voices, and it's about a woman who suddenly begins hearing voices in her head. And the second and final story you'll hear is called Come Back, and it's about a child with totally unbelievable claims. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please replace the Amazon Music follow button's roll-on deodorant ball with a single clove of garlic. Okay, let's get into our first story called Voices.
following story was pulled from a 1997 article in the British Medical Journal. The article was written by the psychiatrist who treated the patient, who will be the focal point of this story. The only reason I bring this up is because this story truly sounds made up, and it's not. One night in the winter of 1984, a healthy middle-aged woman, who we'll call Brenda for this story, was at her home in London reading a book when she suddenly heard a voice in her head. It said,
"Please don't be afraid. I know this must be shocking for you to hear me speaking to you like this, but this was the easiest way I could think of. My friend and I, we used to work at the children's hospital and we would like to help you."
Brenda couldn't believe what was happening. She had never heard voices in her head before, and this voice that was speaking to her, it was so clear, and it did not sound like any voice she had heard before. And so at first, Brenda just sat on the couch and didn't do anything and just waited, hoping that maybe she was just imagining this. But the voice in her head seemed to pick up on her reaction and said,
"Brenda, this is not a hallucination. We're real and we want to help you."
Brenda did not believe it was real. She believed she had just lost her mind. And so for the rest of the night, she just completely ignored the voice in her head, and first thing the next morning, she went to her doctor's office and said, "Please help me." The doctor referred her to a psychiatrist, and so she went over to the psychiatrist's office, and after they performed an evaluation of Brenda, they said, "Look, I don't really know why you're hearing these voices. There's no clear medical explanation for why." And so Brenda was ultimately diagnosed with something called functional hallucinatory psychosis, which basically means Brenda was hallucinating, but there was no clear reason why. The psychiatrist began treating Brenda with an antipsychotic drug as well as with supportive counseling. Over the next couple of weeks, as Brenda diligently took her medications and went to her appointments, the voices eventually stopped. And so Brenda went into her psychiatrist's office and she said, "Doc, you've saved me. The voices are gone. I'm so happy." And the psychiatrist would later recall that Brenda was visibly relieved. It was obvious that she was not making this up, that she really believed that she had these voices and now they were gone. And so after Brenda left the office, she actually went on vacation with her family outside of London just to celebrate the fact that she had not, in fact, lost her mind. But while she was away on holiday, she started hearing the voices again. And this time, they told her she had to get back to London as soon as possible because there was something terribly wrong with her. And they gave her a very specific street address that she was supposed to go to seek treatment. And so Brenda is horrified that the voices are back in the first place, but what she's really scared about is that maybe there's some truth to what these voices are telling me. Maybe there is something wrong with her. And so Brenda ran to her husband and she explained what happened, and he was very reassuring and said, "Look, honey, you should just totally ignore the voices again. There's probably nothing wrong with you. Just try to relax and have a nice vacation." But Brenda could not relax. She could not ignore the voices because they were constantly telling her,
"You need to leave. You need to go back. There's something wrong with you."
And so finally, Brenda convinced her family to end the vacation early and they headed back to London. And as soon as they got there, Brenda made her husband come with her and they drove to the street address the voices had given her. And when they got to this very specific location, they found themselves standing in front of the brain scan unit of a London hospital. Brenda and her husband were totally shocked, but before they could even react to what they were looking at, the voices in Brenda's head came back and they told her,
"You need to go inside and you need to request a brain scan for 2 reasons. 1, there's a tumor in your brain. And 2, this tumor is causing your brainstem to swell."
At this point, Brenda was so scared that this information might actually be true that despite what her husband was saying, she went right inside the brain scan unit and she requested the scan. And when they asked her, who's the doctor that referred you over here? She said, "I don't have one." And then she ultimately told them that, "Well, there are voices in my head that told me to come over here and get this scan." Now, the doctors at the brain scan facility were not totally like, "Get out of here." But instead they said, "Look, this is a very expensive scan. We can't just let you in here and get a scan because the voices told you to. We need a clinical reason to do it. We need a doctor's note saying you need this scan." And so they turned Brenda away, and Brenda now is just a complete wreck. She ends up calling her psychiatrist and she explains the situation about getting this address and being told to get this brain scan. And after a few minutes of hearing her story, her psychiatrist says, "Okay, you know what? I will call over and I will get you an appointment to get a brain scan." because I want you to be at ease, and it seems like this is probably the only way we're going to be able to do that. And so after this conversation, the psychiatrist got in touch with this hospital and he requested the brain scan for Brenda. And about a month later, Brenda went in, she had the scan done, and sure enough, she had a brain tumor and her brainstem was swollen. The doctors couldn't believe it because Brenda was showing absolutely no signs of having this condition. And so they told her that, well, you can just wait and see what happens. This might not have any effect on you. And so you can just wait to see if you get symptoms eventually. Or we can go in and do the surgery and remove this tumor. But of course, doing brain surgery comes with some very significant risks. After thinking it over with her family, Brenda decided to go with immediate surgery. And after telling her doctors as much, the voices in her head told her that she had made the right decision. A couple of days later, Brenda went in and her surgery was a huge success. After she regained consciousness in the recovery room, the voices spoke to her. They said,
"We are pleased to have helped you. Goodbye."
After that, Brenda never heard the voices ever again, and she never had any complications from the surgery or from the tumor. And to this day, the medical community still has no idea who those voices in her head really were.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Come Back. Late one afternoon in December of 1986, a woman named Shanti Singh was sitting on her bed cradling her toddler son, whose name was T2, as he threw a huge temper tantrum. T2, who was 3 years old, had already been throwing this tantrum for about 30 minutes at this point, and it didn't seem like anything Shanti did was getting him to calm down. In fact, honestly, it just seemed like T2 was getting worse and worse by the second. And Shanti knew her son's constant wailing must be annoying her neighbors in the little rural village in northern India where they lived, but again, Shanti just felt like really there was nothing she could do. After all, this was not a typical toddler tantrum. T2 was not throwing this tantrum because he lost a toy or was fighting with his siblings or something. No, the reality was Shanti and her husband had no idea why T2 was throwing this tantrum because T2 threw these tantrums all the time for seemingly no reason, and nothing they did would get him to stop. He would just start throwing these crazy fits, and he would only stop when he was ready. Now, Shanti and her husband had taken T2 to the local doctor, and he'd been examined, and the doctor said, "Look, I think your son's just fine. I can't find anything wrong with him. So whatever's causing him to be so upset, it's got to be psychological." Shanti grabbed her son and tried to give him a hug and kiss to get him to calm down. But as she did that, T2 turned around and tried to hit her in the face and kicked her and punched her. And so Shanti had to kind of fall back on the bed, and T2 at this point, who's still throwing this huge tantrum, he leapt off the bed and ran out of the room. Now, Shanti had already sent the rest of her family, her kids, her husband, outside to wait out this current T2 tantrum. And so for a second, Shanti thought about just laying on the bed and letting her crazy toddler just kind of run around the house until he was done throwing this tantrum. But as Shanti was laying there on the bed, practically crying from frustration, she heard a plate break in the kitchen. And so she jumped up and ran into the kitchen, and there was T2 looking down at the ground where there was a shattered plate on the ground. Clearly, T2 had smashed it on purpose. And so as furious as Shanti was, she suddenly realized that, nothing she could do was going to get this kid to stop. And so right now, the only thing she could do was just put him in a safe place where he couldn't hurt other people or himself or damage anything else. And so Shanti, trying to be as calm as possible, walked up to T2, who's still throwing this tantrum and swinging at her as she's coming near him. And she grabbed him, she turned him around so he couldn't kick her or punch her. She put him into his room and then shut the door. And then she sat down in the hallway with her back up against the door to keep it shut. And then as T2 inside the room began banging on the door and trying to open it, Shanti's sitting there anchoring the door, and she's just praying that her son's going to calm down soon. And then at some point, Shanti heard her son start to say something that typically signaled the end of a tantrum. T2 in the bedroom began saying the word Shirsh Verma, which actually was a nonsense word that Shanti and her husband and the other kids had no idea what it meant.
But, T2, at the end of his tantrums, he would always just start saying over and over again, Shurshverma, Shurshverma, Shurshverma. And so Shanti, she's in the hall and she's hearing T2 start to do that. And so on the one hand, she's thinking, okay, this tantrum's about to end. But on the other, she's like, I have no idea what that word means. It's obviously connected in some way to what's going on with my son, but I have no idea what it means. It sounds like nonsense. And so Shanti began yelling through the door at T2 to explain what Shurshverma meant, but T2 had no explanation. He just kept saying the word over and over again, Shurshverma, Shurshverma, Shurshverma. Shanti and her husband had 5 other kids. T2 was the youngest, and T2 was not like any of his other siblings. The other siblings did not throw temper tantrums like this, not at all. And in fact, T2 had been a difficult child even before he was born. Towards the end of Shanti's pregnancy with T2, she'd become very, very sick, and in fact had to be hospitalized for the entire last trimester. And then as a newborn baby, T2 basically didn't sleep at all, and he cried constantly. And so Shanti and her husband initially thought, T2 must just be a very fussy baby. But in time, as he grew into more of a toddler, it was clear to Shanti and her husband that T2 was actually a different kind of kid. He seemed like a very unhappy and kind of angry kid who was permanently on the verge of crying or throwing a fit. But it wasn't until T2 began talking at around 2 years old that Shanti and her husband really started to become worried. Because the things T2 was saying as a 2-year-old were just not in keeping with what you would expect a 2-year-old to say. And I'm not talking about the nonsense word that T2 would use during his temper tantrums, Shurshverma. Basically, T2 would say things that seemed to indicate that he genuinely hated everyone in his family. Now, for context, Shanti and her family were not poor, but they weren't rich either. They lived in a little concrete home, they didn't have a TV or a car, and all the kids wore hand-me-down clothes, and Shanti actually handmade her clothes and her husband's clothes. But the family always had enough food to eat, and they were educated, and they seemed happy enough. It's just that they didn't really have the ability to do anything extra, like above and beyond a modest life. And T2 had never known anything different. This was his life from the day he was born. But when he learned to speak at around 2 years old, it was like all T2 wanted to talk about was how crappy of a lifestyle their family lived. For example, when T2's mom, Shanti, would put on one of her saris that happened to be ripped, a sari is a traditional garment in India, T2 would look at what she was wearing, and in toddler speak, he would tell her that she looked terrible and that it looked like she was just wearing rags. T2 would also walk around their house and he would point to spots in the house that looked dirty, and he would demand that somebody cleaned it up because he didn't want to live in a dirty house. And then whenever the family needed to go somewhere and they would walk there or take the bus there, T2 would complain the entire time that he wanted to be in a car. And why aren't we driving in a car? Like, why are we walking? Despite the fact that T2 basically had never used a car before. But perhaps the strangest aspect of T2's behavior was around the time he began talking and insulting his family, he also began talking about this very historic city called Agra, which was located about 8 miles away from where they lived. Agra was famous for being home to the Taj Mahal, which is considered to be one of the most beautiful buildings ever made. Agra also has a very busy downtown and lots of tourism, but T2 had never been to Agra, and there was no reason he would be drawn to Agra, like his family had no connection to that city. But starting around the time T2 began talking at 2 years old, he began asking to go to Agra several times a week. And when his parents would say, no, we're not going to go to Agra, T2 would throw a huge tantrum. And so not long after T2 had begun speaking and saying all these terrible things, Shanti and her husband decided that really all they could do was just wait and hope their son grew out of this terrible behavior. But T2 did not grow out of this. Shortly after his parents decided to just kind of wait it out, T2 would randomly attack another small child with a sugarcane, and he beat the kid so badly the kid was bleeding at the end of the attack. And then also another time, shortly after the sugarcane beating, T2 was at the store with his mother, and his mom was looking at this bracelet, which she couldn't afford. She was just looking at it through the glass. And T2 sensed his mom wanted the bracelet, and in an odd show of affection for his mother, he turned to the shopkeeper, this little tiny kid who's not even 3 years old yet, and he tells the shopkeeper that if he doesn't give this bracelet to his mother for free, that Titu will shoot and kill the shopkeeper. And so after this, Shanti and her husband just stopped taking Titu out in public at all. It was just too embarrassing. But what really just unsettled Shanti the most about her son's behavior was that nonsense word that Titu kept saying at the end of all of his tantrums. Shirsh Verma, Shirsh Verma. And so fast forward to that day after he's broken the plate and now Shanti's put him in his room, Titu began saying that nonsense word, except he was getting a little bit older and his speech was getting a little bit more clear. And so as Shanti was laying up against the door, she realized that her son was not saying a single word, Shirsh Verma. He was saying two words. They were Suresh Varma. But Shanti had no idea what that meant. She thought it sounded like a name, but it was a name she had never heard before. But one day, a few months after the dish-breaking incident in April of 1987, all of Titu's very strange, erratic, terrible behaviors would erupt all at once. That April day started out like any other. Shanti made breakfast for her family, and then her husband headed out to do some errands, and her 6 children kind of dispersed around the inside and outside of the house to play, study, whatever. But Titu was really grouchy, and so he stayed inside in the kitchen with Shanti. A little while later, Shanti's oldest son came into the kitchen, and he asked his mother, "Hey, when will Dad get back from his trip to Agra?" Shanti's husband had gone to Agra to run one of his chores, and Agra was the city that Titu was totally obsessed with. And so when Shanti's oldest son said the word Agra, Titu, who was sitting in the kitchen, he heard it and kind of looked up like he was totally fixated on their conversation. And then as Shanti and her oldest were talking about the dad, Titu just got up, left the kitchen, and he went to his room. He grabbed a couple of things, and then he came back into the kitchen carrying this bundle of clothes with him. And he walked right past his brother and his mother. He went out the front door and began running down the road without saying a word. Remember, this is like a 3-year-old child. This is not a teenager. This is a little kid. And so Shanti and her oldest son, they kind of watched in shock as Titu ran off down the road. And for a minute, neither of them did anything. And then it was like they broke out of their trance and the oldest son just turned and began running out of the house to catch up with Titu. Now, it didn't take long for the oldest to catch up with his young brother, but it was surprisingly hard to stop Titu from trying to run away. He fought back as hard as he could to keep his brother from pulling him back to the house. And then when the older brother got Titu back inside, Shanti looked at her older son and she saw he had a black eye from where Titu had just hit him. And when Shanti turned to Titu to try to get him to apologize to his brother for hitting him, she saw Titu was completely inconsolable. He was throwing a huge temper tantrum. He was on the ground kicking and flailing and screaming at the top of his lungs. And so Shanti and her oldest son knew there was no hope in getting him to calm down. He was deep into one of his tantrums. And so Shanti and the oldest just basically restrained Titu so he couldn't hurt himself or one of them or damage anything. And for a while, as they held him to the ground, Titu just continued to scream and flail and throw this fit. But eventually he did kind of calm down and he began saying Suresh Verma over and over again. But then he began talking about something that he really hadn't brought up before that stood out to Shanti and her oldest son. Titu, in addition to saying periodically Suresh Verma, also began talking about some radio store in Agra. And Titu kept saying, "Why didn't Dad bring me to the radio store? Why didn't he bring me?" And so as Shanti is listening to her son, she suddenly thinks, you know what? This is my chance. He's being so specific about this radio store. Maybe this is my opportunity to lean in and learn what the heck is going on with my kid. And so once Titu fully stopped his temper tantrum and Shanti and her oldest could finally let go of him, once Titu had left the room, Shanti turned to her oldest son and she told him to go to Agra right now. Just go there and look for a radio store or something. Look for anything that could be a clue to what's going on with Titu. He obviously has some fixation with the city. Just go, look around, see if you can find something. So the oldest son left the house and he went to one of his friends' houses who had a car, and together they drove into Agra. Now, Shanti had no idea if her oldest son's trip to Agra would produce anything useful, but she figured, she's got nothing to lose. A few hours later, when Shanti's oldest son returned from Agra, he came into their home with a very serious look on his face. And right away, Shanti could tell, clearly, he's discovered something. And so Shanti asked her oldest son, tell me, what did you learn? What happened in Agra? And the oldest son, he looked down for a second, and then he looked back at his mom and he just said, tomorrow we're going to have visitors. The next day, a car pulled up in front of Shanti's home and 6 people climbed out. There was a woman wearing a beautiful red sari who appeared to be in her 30s, and then there were 3 other men who also appeared to be in their 30s, and they were all wearing suits and jackets. And there was also an older couple, a man and a woman, and the man was wearing this beautiful sweater, and the woman had on all this silk. It was clear, just from the way they looked, that these 6 people were not from this area. They were from somewhere else, and they had a ton of money. Now, Shanti was inside the house and she was watching this group arrive, but she did not go outside to greet them. She, her husband, and all of her kids, minus T2, had decided the night before, when they knew these visitors were going to arrive, that they wouldn't go out and talk to them. Instead, they would just allow T2 to basically make first contact with these people and see what happens. So when Shanti saw this group of 6 very well-off people were standing right outside of their gate, kind of waiting to be let in, she called for T2 and said, hey, go outside and open the gate for our guests. And so T2, who was not throwing a fit at this point, he came running through the house and he went to the door. He's not looked outside yet. He opens up the door and he runs outside and he sees these 6 people on the other side of the gate. And suddenly Shanti heard T2 make a sound that he never made. It was like the sound of pure joy. He was so elated to see these 6 people. Shanti couldn't believe it. For a second, Shanti closed her eyes and almost started crying because she knew, even before T2 had made that joyous sound when he saw these people, they were about to solve the mystery of what was going on with her son. Just then, Shanti heard T2 from outside yelling for Shanti and the rest of his family to come outside and meet his other family. Shanti went to the door and gestured for the guests to come inside, and then she led them through the house to the back deck. And then after they were all seated, Shanti looked over at her son, T2, and she saw he had this huge grin on his face. He was so happy, and he was staring intently at the woman who got out of the car, who was in her 30s and wearing the beautiful red sari, and she was sitting right across the table from T2, and T2 is just locked on her. Now, at this point, nobody is speaking. Everybody is just sitting there. No introductions have been made, so nobody even knows each other's names. And in this kind of tense and awkward silence, T2, who again is just staring at this woman in red, he eventually breaks the silence, the 3-year-old child, and he asks the woman in red to come sit next to him. And so the woman in the red sari, she does what he asks and moves over and sits next to the toddler. And then T2 looked up at her and he smiled and he said, do you know who I am? And the woman, she's looking down at him and she said, no, I don't. And T2 would look back up at her and he would say, I know who you are. You're Uma. And at this, the woman in red, whose name really was Uma, she gasped. She had no idea how this kid knew who she was. But before she could even say anything, T2 continued. And he said to her, hey, do you remember when we went to the fair with Ranu and Sanu and I bought you those sweets? And at this, the woman in the red sari, Uma, she had this new look come over her face. Instead of looking like she was just kind of shocked and appalled that this random kid knew who she was, now it was like a look of shocked recognition as she's looking down at T2, like she suddenly understood what was actually going on. And at the same time, T2's mother, Shanti, was watching this happen and she was kind of piecing together what was really going on here. And suddenly she realized she needed to check something. And she got up and she ran out of the room and she came back with scissors. And without saying anything, Shanti went straight to T2. She pushed his head to the side, exposing his right ear, and she used those scissors and began cutting all the hair off his head that was kind of drooped over his right ear, kind of exposing the right side of his skull. And as the hair on T2's head fell to the ground, exposing more and more of the right side of his head, all the adults watching just gasped. And the whole time, T2 was just smiling. To understand what just happened out on that back porch between these random people and Shanti and her family, you need some context. So here's what happened when Shanti's oldest son was sent to Agra to go investigate and look for clues that could explain what was going on with Titu. The brother and his friend had driven all around Agra, looking for radio stores and looking for things that might in some way kind of connect to Titu, and they didn't see anything. But at some point, they drove past one of the many radio stores in Agra, and the name of this radio store immediately stood out to the brother and this friend. So the older brother and the friend, they parked their car and they went into this particular radio shop, and inside of there is where they met Uma, the woman who had the red sari on, who was in her 30s, that Titu said we went to the fair together with, that woman. So she's inside this radio shop. And when the older brother asked Uma how this radio shop got its name, that was when things began to fall into place for this older brother about what was going on with Titu. Uma would tell the older brother that this radio shop actually belonged to her husband, except 3.5 years ago, he was murdered. He was shot and killed. And so she had been running the shop ever since. And Uma said she had considered changing the name of the shop, since taking it over, but she just couldn't bring herself to change it because the shop's name was actually based on her husband's name. The name of the shop was Suresh Radio Shop. Her husband's name was Suresh Verma. The two words that Titu would say all the time at the end of his tantrums, Suresh Verma, Suresh Verma. That was Uma's husband. And it would turn out the details of Suresh's death matched up in a very bizarre way with Titu's birth. And all of Titu's totally erratic, strange, terrible behavior throughout really his entire life to this point now suddenly made sense if you knew about Suresh's life. Many people, including professors from major universities in India and America, have come to believe that what happened with Titu was when Suresh was murdered, his spirit somehow came out of his body and entered Titu's body. Basically, Suresh was reincarnated in Titu. This reincarnation theory would explain why Titu was always saying Suresh Verma, because in theory, that was his real name. That's the guy who died, who then his spirit transitioned to Titu. So he's saying his name over and over again. And then also Titu's obsession with Agra would make sense because that's where Suresh's radio shop was and where he lived. Also, the reincarnation theory would explain why Titu was so critical of Shanti and the rest of his family's lifestyle, basically accusing them of being poor and kind of living below his station. Well, Suresh's family was very, very wealthy, and so that was the lifestyle Suresh had lived. And so if his spirit was now in Titu's body, he might be at odds with their lifestyle. And lastly, the reincarnation theory would explain the two very unique and very pronounced birthmarks that Titu had right next to his right ear. He had one right above his right ear and right below it. Now, these were birthmarks that Shanti was well aware of, but after she learned about how Suresh Verma was killed, he was shot in the side of his head, and the bullet went in above his right ear and then came out on the bottom part of his right ear. When she heard that, she ran and got the scissors, she cut the hair away around Titu's ear, revealing the two birthmarks, and then the other families saw those birthmarks and they're like, oh my goodness, that is literally where the entry and exit wounds were on Suresh. And then also it's worth pointing out that on the day Suresh was shot and killed, well, basically that day was when Titu's mother, Shanti, began feeling really sick during her pregnancy with Titu, and she had to be hospitalized. After this discovery about Titu and Suresh Verma, Shanti and her husband and the rest of her family expected Titu to want to live with Uma and his other family. And at first, that is what Titu wanted to do, but pretty quickly he actually decided that, you know what, I want to stay put with the family I was born into, and we can just visit with the other family. And so that's what they did. Uma and the other wealthy family, they made visits all the time to see Titu and vice versa. The families got along great. And as for Titu, he was really happy. His bad behavior basically went away and he became a normal, high-functioning kid. And Titu has grown up and become a very happy and successful adult. He's got a family of his own, and he's currently a professor at a college in India.
A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events.
But we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. There's this one, of course, the MrBallen Podcast, and there's MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, Redacted, and Late Nights with Nexpo. All you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like this one, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.